Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto denies the civilian council. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Edaar the Mage and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. Welcome home. Where am I? What's going on? Why do I feel so tired? Who I am? So tired. Darkness again enveloped the mind, it had been happening more and more, the brief moments of awakening and sanity. But the moments were beginning to lasting longer each time. Flashes would enter the mind, memories, a castle on fire, a village taking a small girl in, a blonde-haired man with loving eyes, and pain. Pain was always the last memory before the darkness returned. An unknown amount of time passed in the darkness. No feelings, no emotions, no memories, just darkness. And as her eyes opened she saw around her tubes leading to machines, there were only a few of them, and the tubes seemed connected to her. She breathed slowly as the memories came again. The room was dark, it looked as if it was rarely attended, and the lights were dimmed. She tried to move her arms, but they barely managed a motion before dropping back to rest beside her. She couldn't complete a thought, her mind was a torrent of unknown and confusion, a haze seemed to be covering her thoughts. She lay there a few minutes, waiting for the darkness to again envelope her. Her eyes dimmed and then brightened with each breath, the darkness slowly receding, but leaving her with no idea of who she was or where she was. Slowly her hand moved to remove the tubes in her arm. It was slightly painful, but she let out a sigh of relief as she felt the needles leave her body. She tried to rise but found herself too weak to do so. She merely managed to move her head from side to side. The room she was in was a small cell. Each side was concrete blocks with white paint over them. It was a small room with little more than enough space for her cot, the machines around her, and enough room for a single person to move around comfortably. The door to the room looked unlocked and the outside hallway was dark. Trying again she managed to raise her head, her mind swimming in confusion at the movement after being in darkness for so long. Her arms were beginning to regain feeling and she ran her fingers down her legs, she could feel her legs and her fingers on the smooth skin. She let out a small sigh of contentment at the touch and the returning of feeling in her body. Slowly she began to move herself again, each time managing to move a little more. Her body felt enormously heavy and stubbornly refused to move at her command. She had to slowly move each part of her body as feeling returned until she finally managed to move herself into a sitting position and surveyed herself. Her hair was long and hung in a dirty tangled mess. Her body was covered only by a hospital gown but appeared uninjured. The haze in her mind was beginning to finally clear and her mind began with questions again. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? I must escape. The final thought crossed her mind as she tried to stand from her cot only to find her legs had trouble supporting her. Her legs simply didn't have the strength to maintain her body and collapsed underneath her. She fell back to the cot was made of a single sheet of wood with a small pad for its only comfort and as she fell she felt her body strike the wood underneath. She tried again using her hands on the machines next to her to support her. She took deep breaths as she tried to walk forward, pushing herself toward the door. One step, a second step, slowly her legs began to remember their function. Her legs trembled and burned in retaliation to their use after so long asleep. She made it to the door but was still struggling to remain standing. She stopped and began to take deep breaths, she had only gone but a few steps and already her legs were protesting that much use. Shaking her head she forced herself to calm down. She tried the doorknob and found it unlocked. The hallway before her was silent and darkened with a light coat of dirt. The sides of the hallway were made of compacted dirt and the ceiling concrete, giving mute testimony that there were more levels above her. The floor beneath her was made of the same concrete. It was hard and rough under her bare feet. She took a deep breath and placed a hand on the wall beside her for support, leaning heavily as she began to walk down the hallway. Occasionally she would pass doors, but she ignored them lost in her thoughts. She had no idea how long had passed, but flashes came to her mind, memories surfacing after so long. She saw a place and people, they had red hair and green eyes, they were laughing and smiling. Then she saw a castle in the mountains on fire, people dead and dying, a hand holding hers leading her away from it. She stared in horror at the destruction around her and looked at the man holding her hand. He smiled at her and squeezed, his brown eyes trying to give her comfort. It was in a flash that she saw the giant gates to a great village, it was gigantic, larger than anything she had ever seen before. She was told she'd be safe there and to be careful with her knowledge of who she was and where she came from. The man with the brown eyes handed her safety over to an older man, he had lines on his face but smiled gently at her and he radiated strength and confidence and was obviously still in his prime. The lights in the hallway began to brighten bringing her back to the here and now. Her eyes hurt slightly at the brightened lights, but thankfully it wasn't much and her eyes began to slowly adjust. There was still no sound, but brighter lights meant this place was more used than the one she came from. She slowed and took a moment to catch her breath. She hadn't realized how tired her body was from simply walking. After a few minutes to catch her breath she continued on, her eyes wandering over the different doors and paths she could take. But she continued down this corridor, it seemed to be the main one that the others connected to, and her body simply wanted to continue in a straight line, it was easier. Finally she came to crossroads, the corridor she followed branched off going right or left, but no indication of which one was the exit. Without knowing it her hands felt the walls, as if on their own accord, and noticed one side was smoother than the other, and her feet felt for the slight wear on the full, which indicated that one path was more traversed. And so she chose to go right and follow the instincts of her body. As she followed the hallway her memories surfaced again, she saw herself in a classroom, she was writing something. She saw a young blonde boy near her who laughed with her and talked to her. Then an older version of the boy became superimposed and she saw the love in his eyes. The image seemed to recede and she saw they were standing on the balcony of a tower and a sense of safety surrounded her in the memory. Again she was brought back to reality as her nose caught a new scent. She had no way to understand how much time had passed, but her body was beginning to hunger, but when she caught a breath of air, it was different. Her nose was used to the cold, stale air around, but this was different. It was fresh air from above. She looked for the source and saw a doorway she had passed and moved backward and sniffed again, and again she smelled fresh air coming from the door. She opened it to find a stairway leading up and down. The stairway had a few lights, but it wasn't much more than the previous hallway, and the stairs were made from the same concrete as the hallway. She stood in the hallway for a few minutes allowing herself time to rest before continuing on. Her brow was beaded with sweat and her body was cramping up from the short walk to the stairs. Following her nose she began to take the stairs upward moving slow as her legs began to burn from the exertion. Her entire body was tired beyond anything she could understand. Her reactions felt sluggish as she forced herself to move up the stairs and her mind seemed to have a constant cloud over it. Her movements were more something made from reflex and reaction than conscious choice. She followed the stairs as high as they would take her until it came to stop at a doorway. For the fourth time she stopped and breathed heavily, she was so tired and every muscle in her body was burning from the exertion of the climb. She pushed the door open to find herself in a small room with no exit. It was dark and she was confused. Her nose told her that there was fresh air behind the wall, but she couldn't find a way out. She began to unconsciously feel the wall. What her hands were searching for she wasn't sure, but eventually her fingers found a spot that wasn't like the others, it was slightly softer, more pliable, it was different. She pressed the point and a small opening appeared in the wall. She went through the opening and found herself in a supply closet filled with cleaners, brooms, and various other cleaning supplies. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. She listened and heard voices in the hallway before her. She froze and instinct alone told her to move, and through hardwired reflex, she flattened herself against the wall next to the door, so not as to be discovered. As the voices passed she breathed slightly easier. She opened the door slightly and saw the light beaming through the crack was brighter than anything she was used to. Her eyes immediately felt pain as if someone had pierced them with a burning nail. She brought her hand up to protect her eyes and silently closed the door. It took her eyes a few minutes before they returned their normal sight to her. She knew she couldn't remain, her instincts were screaming to keep moving, that staying in that closet would lead to capture. She took several deep breaths and opened the door. She kept her eyes almost entirely closed and a hand to protect them from the harsh light and instead used her free hand on the wall and the feeling over her bare feet to guide her to where her nose said was outside. The hallway she was walking on was brightly lit from ceiling lamps. The floor was tiled and the walls were whitewashed and cleaned. She began to move quickly following her noise to the scent of the outside. She broke through a small reception area and she heard several people gasp in her direction. Her mind shut down, she had been discovered, and training and reflex so hardwired in her that it acted without her even telling it to on a conscious level took over. She flung herself to the side near the door and with the door to her back and quickly exited the building. She heard the sound of more people coming and pressed the door handle opening the door and found herself outside. Her mind wanted nothing more than to stop and stare at the world around her, and dozens of people stopped and stared at her. She must have looked like a mad woman with her hair matted and dirty the way it was and wearing nothing but a hospital gown to cover her body. But then she saw the tower, the one from her memories. The one place that screamed safety in her mind. She was certain he would be there, the blonde man with the blue eyes who held such emotion for her. And again her training took over and her body was forced into a run as she bolted for the tower. She wasn't sure how she was able to run, her primal flight sense had taken over and pushed her body well beyond its limits on pure adrenaline. She knew she was being followed, she felt it around her, she heard the voices, and she knew the shadows were moving. Her eyes were blinded by the light of the sun and hurt painfully, she simply couldn't see anything, but her body knew this path, knew these roads. She moved faster with each step, her body flooded with emotion as memories of the blonde man returned to her. She ran off the power of raw emotion. Candlelit dinners with him, holding his hand, the feeling of his lips, it all returned in a rush as she took step after step toward the tower. Her heart was racing, her eyes watered and tears escaped, her body was pushed beyond its ability in her weakened state, but she felt the doors to the tower with her fingers and pushed her way in before continuing her flight. Adrenaline pumped through her system as she ran through the corridors. She heard voices shouting to stop her as her mad rush she made it to a reception area. Her eyes were able to see fuzzy shapes and she could just make out the doors before her. Then hands were around her, they were pulling her back from the doors. And she screamed with all the pain and remorse and terror in her body, the one word that came to her as she struggled against the hands pulling her back from the doors, Minato. Suddenly everyone stopped, they were silent at the cry. They stared at the woman who had fallen to her knees before them. She sobbed on her knees, tears streaming down her dirty face. They watched her as pants struck their own hearts at the sight, and all they could hear saying as she began to crawl toward the door was Minato over and over between her sobs as she tried to reach out to the office of the Hokage of the village hidden in the leaves. The doors opened as a frantic Hiruzen Sarutobi emerged. The old man wore the white Hokage robes outlined in red. His hat had been left inside next to his pipe on his desk. He had heard the woman scream the name of his predecessor, something he had never expected in the last 10 years. In a rush had opened the door to find a crying young woman crawling toward his office. She looked up at him, her eyes barely able to make out his shape and the tears streaming down her dirt-covered face. He stopped and gasped at her. Her hair, it was clean, would be a deep red and long. Her eyes were emerald green and her skin pale from lack of light. She was half naked in her hospital gown and her hands were stretched in a pleading stance as she said Minato's name over and over through her sobs. Her face was thin and gaunt and her body looked as it had been extremely malnourished. Everyone, no one is to speak of this. Get this woman into my office immediately, send for a team of medics from the hospital, the best we have. I want a futon in my office for this woman to lie down on as well and blankets and tea. I want a contingent of Anbu around my office with the highest security immediately. The third Hokage ordered. Everyone simply stared at the sobbing and hysterical woman before them, before he released an immense amount of killing intent at them. I said now. Get moving. As everyone immediately vacated the area Hiruzen leaned down and picked the woman up and carried her into his office in his own arms. She was still crying hysterically as more and more memories began to surface. A futon was brought into his office immediately, along with several blankets and a pot of tea and some brushes and extra clothing. He thanked them for thinking ahead as he laid the woman down on and covered her in the blankets. She had felt as light as paper to the old man, he couldn't believe she weighed so little. Her lips were dry and cracked and her eyes were slowly regaining a sense of where she was. He lifted a cup of tea to her and she drank sips from it. She had finally calmed down once she was brought into the office, it was somewhere she associated with safety and security. She had tried to lift a cup of tea herself, but failed, her bolt to the tower had simply taken everything her body had left and it was shutting down on her, her muscles were giving out from exhaustion now and the Hokage helped her lay back against the pillows gently. She felt safe here and she knew the old man would keep her safe in this place. She began to relax more and more as her body demanded rest of her. Her mind and body wrapped themselves in the safety of this place, she knew it was safe from anything. She also knew the man before her, he was older, but she knew he was the same one who had welcomed her to the village in her memories. The team of medics arrived within minutes and began to examine. They gave her a sedative which allowed her to promptly fall asleep on the futon. The team went to work and their hands glowed green as they checked her vitals and healed any possible damage from her run to the tower. They took blood samples and had them sent to the lab. It was late in the evening when they finished their examination and gave their reports. Her entire body is atrophied, like we see in long-term coma patients. Her mind seems to be intact, but we have found traces of drugs in her blood which we use to induce medical comas in patients who have been seriously injured and required time and rest to recover. We can't find anything wrong with her aside from horrible malnutrition and the muscle atrophy. We're already working to reconstruct her muscular development and we'll see about removing the remaining traces of the drug before morning. Even with our work on her muscular system, she'll need several months of fitness training and good dieting to regain the bulk of her lost weight and muscle tissue. But we should be able to reconstruct it enough to where she won't have to stay in the hospital. The drug is probably messing with her mind and memories. For someone to be placed into a medically induced coma like this for so long to allow these symptoms to come about are just horrible. Lord Hokage, it would explain the way she acted when she got here, she probably had some memory of this tower being safe and came to it for protection. Thank you, continue your work. I will be remaining here with the woman until she wakes up. You and your team are not to mention this to anyone, understand? Hiruzen told them. With a nod and a bow the medic returned to his work as Hiruzen sat and watched. He wouldn't let them out of sight at all. The Hokage lost himself to his thoughts as he watched the medic's work on the woman before him. He was deeply concerned by what this meant. Kushina Uzumaki, Minato's wife and lover, we thought she was dead these past 10 years. She simply disappeared and hasn't been heard from since that day, and now here she is. Whatever it means, it is going to be a lot of paperwork, the Hokage thought to himself. It was early morning when the woman awoke again. She found it easier to move and she was laying comfortably on the futon. She raised her head and looked around and saw the old man before her. Her memories were still groggy from the after effects of the drugs used to keep her in the coma, but she knew to whom she was speaking. Lord Third Hokage, what are you doing here? I thought Minato would be here. Her voice was merely a whisper as it escaped her lips. It's alright Kushina, I'll have some tea brought in immediately, just rest a moment. I want you to tell me everything you can remember and I'll fill in the gaps as best I can. And just call me Hiruzen for now, alright? The third Hokage spoke gently to the woman before him, knowing she was still confused and probably didn't have all of her memories back yet. The tea arrived, it was a special blend from the Hokage's own garden and had a very good calming effect on people. He handed a cup to Kushina, who took several sips and thanked the Hokage. Now why don't we start from the beginning, tell me everything, your name, where you're from, and please start from the beginning. This room has been secured from intrusion and I have a contingent of Anbu outside guarding us. I also have a silencing jutsu placed around us so no one can hear our conversation. You're safe here Kushina, I promise. He smiled gently at her and she nodded. Kushina nodded, my name is Kushina Uzumaki Namikaze, well, most people know me as Kushina Uzumaki. I was born in the Whirlpool country which was destroyed and absorbed into the Land of Fire. I came here when I was young, 7 years old, brought by my bodyguard. I was the only survivor of the royal line, but I chose to remain here and go to the academy and become a Kunoichi of the Leaf Village. The memories had come back with more clarity when she had awoken, and she was now sitting on the futon with the blankets wrapped tightly around her as she held the cup of tea in her hands, taking sips every so often. I fought for the village in the Great Shinobi War and earned the nickname the Crimson Death. I also met Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, while at the academy, who helped me through the academy and was my best friend and later my husband. I remember our wedding, it was a quiet wedding with only a few friends, and I remember her eyes suddenly shot open, her body froze as the final pieces fell into place, and she dropped the cup of tea as she grabbed Hiruzen's robes and pulled her to her face. Naruto. My god, where is Naruto? Is he okay? What's happened to him? Where is Minato? He did it, didn't he? He sealed the beast in our son, and he's gone. That's why you're here and he isn't. Where is Naruto? I have to find him. Kushina began to rise only to be held back by Hiruzen as he pulled her back to the futon and placed his arm around her in a hug. He was much stronger than she remembered, or she was much weaker. It was then that Kushina realized how thin she felt as she had tried to rise and brought her hands to her face and saw how thin her arms and body were. She felt her hair and realized how dirty she was. But none of this mattered, the only thing on her mind was Naruto. She had to get to Naruto and make sure he was safe. A lot has happened Kushina, please calm down, take some deep breaths, I'll explain everything. Naruto is safe and well, I assure you. Please just give me a moment to collect my thoughts and I'll bring you up to speed, Hiruzen spoke in a claiming voice as he held the woman in check by him. He knew she was still terribly weak from her ordeal and would need time to recover, but he also knew they needed information on where she had been all these years. Kushina took several deep breaths as the Hokage handed her another cup of tea. He took a moment to allow her to breathe and gather herself for what he had to say. Minato did seal the Kyuubi no Yoko within Naruto that night he was born. That was 10 years ago Kushina, we thought you were dead. And you're right, that's why Minato isn't here, but I assure you that Naruto is safe and healthy. He is 10 years old and if I don't miss my guess he'll grow up to look almost exactly like Minato did. We'll go see him very soon, I know you don't like it, but we need to figure a few things out before we leave here. Kushina, where have you been? We thought you were dead and now you suddenly appear, what happened? The momentum of the word struck Kushina Uzumaki as if a mountain had been dropped on her. 10 years of her life was gone. 10 years with her son. And Minato was gone as well. She felt the weight of those words press down on her as she struggled to remember that night so many years ago. It had been storming outside, they knew the Kyuubi was approaching and Minato didn't have much time. I had just given birth and Minato was there, he smiled and we were so happy. Even though we knew what was coming we wanted to be a family if just for a moment. Then the Anbu arrived, they told him the Kyuubi was nearby and he was needed. He smiled at me and kissed me cheek telling me that he was glad to know Naruto wouldn't grow up alone. Then a squad of Anbu arrived shortly after that and I was told they were moving me to a more secure location, something about protecting the roots of the village. I thought it was a term of endearment for their Hokage and his family, but as soon as we were outside the hospital I was rendered unconscious. Then the next thing I knew I was in some kind of cell and strapped down to a table and they were taking blood samples and I heard these voices talking about the Kyuubi container's mother and wondering if I was a random choice or someone special for my blood. They didn't seem to know I was Minato's wife. As she talked her memories returned sharper and she recalled the voice and the face of the man who had imprisoned her. I remember. Yes. One of the voices is Danzo. That son of a bitch. He did this to me with his root. I'll kill him for this. Kushina screamed as her very essence burned with hatred for the man who had stolen 10 years of her life, 10 years away from her son, and she again tried to rise as her rage took over her as her memories returned from that night. No Kushina, I'll handle Danzo, he won't escape justice for this. I promise. From what the medic nins could find they must have determined nothing special about you and simply put you into a medically induced coma. Also if you were out of the way he would have a much easier chance of taking Naruto as his own and turning the boy into a weapon. If I would guess Danzo probably thought he might be able to use you later as a bargaining chip against Naruto if he ever became like his father, but didn't want to leave you alive or awake knowing your reputation, Hiruzen said to calm the raging woman. Right now, the most important thing is to get you healthy and return you to your son. I know it's going to be hard for you, but I think you need to understand what he's gone through for the past 10 years. I know Minato hoped he would treat it as a hero, but as the Hokage was about to begin his story Kushina interrupted. Minato always put too much faith in the village, I knew our son would be treated badly, but I thought I would be there to be with him and hold him and comfort him. I figured if I was there he would be safe from harm and the village would accept him a normal boy a lot easier, I take it that didn't happen. Her voice was filled with rage at being denied her son for so long, missing so many times she could be with him, to push him on the swing, so many birthdays she had missed, and her eyes had tears streaming down them as she felt a wave of regret pass over her. I'm afraid not, most of the people couldn't tell the difference between the container and the monster contained within. I'm sorry Kushina, I wanted to do more for him, but I passed a law which made it illegal to discuss the Kyuubi no Yoko or its confinement or to harm the boy under pain of death and I have carried out that sentence many times to protect him. Many stores refuse to sell to him or they charge him higher prices and the parents told their children to stay away from him. The way I understand it, he's had a very lonely life and I've done my best, but there is only so much I can do, I'm sorry Kushina. He saw Kushin's tears increase as she cried in silence. Her hands clenched into fists and he knew she was close to flying off again. But it hasn't been all bad, let me tell you about him before you pass too much judgment. Several clans tried to adopt him when he was found to be an orphan including the Naras, the branch clan of the Hyuga, Akimichis, Inuzukas, they all wanted to keep him safe and honor his father's will. Their children have kind of become friends with Naruto. And you'll know him immediately, he has such faith in humanity Kushina, he's such a caring person, even after everything he wants to become Hokage to protect this village and earn their respect. Reminds me of you when he talks about earning others' respects. He sounds like my little Naruto, I want him be alone a moment longer Hiruzen, I want to see him immediately, Kushina said as she rose and felt the blankets begin to slip off her shoulders to reveal her half-naked state in the hospital gown. The third Hokage had averted his eyes as she blushed and gathered the blankets around her again. Maybe you should shower and get a change of clothes first and a meal. The medic said you were in safe condition, but malnourished, so we need to get you fed, Hiruzen told her as she continued to blush in front of the old man. She was handed a robe and led to the Hokage Tower's private bathing area for VIPs. Kushina knew exactly what the bathroom was like since she and Minato had come there several times together. She blushed as she thought of Minato's toned body against hers as the hot water rained down on them. She remembered his strong arms holding her to him and her breasts pressed against his firm chest. She sighed at the memories brought back in the room and then depression hit her as she remembered that was more than 10 years ago and that she would never hold her love again. But her heart held up by the thought of finally seeing her little Naruto again and she knew nothing would stop her from that moment, but she also didn't want to look like a mad woman when he saw her for the first time. She turned the hot water on and began to scrub her body clean of the dirt and grime which had accumulated over the years. Her hair was the worst part and she was forced to spend nearly an hour untangling it and straightening it out. After scrubbing her skin raw and removing the smells of dirt and decay which had followed her, she exited the shower to find a fresh robe and several sets of clothing laid out for her. She decided on a pair of black pants and a dark green shirt with a black jacket with red swirls on the shoulders. She had thought about a dress as being more appropriate, but none had been provided. She quickly dressed and dried her hair, allowing it to hang freely before returning to the Hokage's office. You look much better Kushina, are you feeling alright? I had some lunch brought for you, my private chef whipped up your old favorite, miso ramen, Hiruzen told her, but she shook her head. No Hiruzen, I will not eat until I find my Naruto. My first meal will be with him, I want to see him now, it's been longer than I wanted to wait anyway, and I won't wait a moment longer. I agreed with you on getting changed and showered before going, but now that that's done I will see my son. The fire in Kushina's eyes was so bright it nearly caused Hiruzen to fall back from his chair. He knew that there was no way this was an impostor, only Kushina Uzumaki would have such a spark inside her. He smiled as it reminded him of Naruto. Alright, let's see, by the time we get to the academy he should be getting out of class for lunch anyway. So let's go reunite you with your son Kushina. With a sharp nod the third Hokage left the Hokage tower in the presence of the red-headed woman who had come bursting in the day before crying for Minato Namikaze. As they walked down the hallway many people stopped and stared at Kushina. Her flight the day before had caused many to wonder at who she was, and now that she was cleaned up, even as thin as she was, every recognized the beauty of the woman before them. As they exited the tower Kushina stared at the changes to the village, things were the same but different. Shops which had been new when she had last visited them showed signs of age and either fortune or hard times. She felt oddly out of place as she walked with the Hokage. For her mere days had passed since walking through this market with Minato. And now things were different and yet the same. She couldn't help feel the loss in her heart as she knew that never again would Minato's smiling face be seen to meet her for ramen or walk with her arm in arm. She looked at the people around her, many not recognizing her as the woman who had fled to the tower the day before as she was lost in thought. The realization was slowly taking hold of her again and its enormity was overwhelming. Minato was gone and she had missed out on 10 years of her son's life. It was gone in the blink of an eye and before she knew it she and Hokage had stopped outside the academy and were watching as the children came outside to play. They all looked so happy and glad to be out of class and she immediately picked out the different clans from the group but she couldn't find her own Naruto's blonde head. I don't see him Hiruzen, where is he? She asked as her entire being was caught in that moment. The old Hokage chuckled, watch the black-haired girl there and you'll find him. Kushina looked everywhere for her son but she couldn't find him. She did however see a small black and blue-haired girl with pale lavender eyes moving away from the crowd and toward a group of trees. She followed the girl her eyes and found that she was watching something. Curious she followed the girl's gaze to a small blonde-haired child. He was sitting alone making a cup of instant ramen far from the other children. He smiled brightly as the ramen finished being made and her heart nearly stopped in her chest. She had seen that smile every day on Minato's face and in her dreams. He was the spitting image of Minato when he was that age and tears began to run down her face. She took a step forward toward the child before turning the next step into a sprint to the boy. She came to a stop a few feet from him and looked him in wonder. Her green eyes had tears running down them and she could only stare at the blonde-haired Naruto before him. Naruto looked at the red-haired woman before him with a bright smile and waved at her, hi. I'm Naruto, who are you? Would you like some ramen? She stared speechless at the boy and dropped to a single knee, and Naruto, why you're beautiful. Thanks I think. Are you okay? You're crying? He asked with concern in his voice. Naruto was thoroughly confused by the woman before him and wasn't sure what to make of her. Naruto, my little Naruto, you look just like him, like your father, my name is Kushina Naruto, Kushina Uzumaki. I'm why your mother my little Naruto. Kushina's entire heart stopped at that moment as she watched her son's reaction, her entire being had been so afraid of this moment when the Hokage had told her she had been gone for so long. She was so afraid he would reject her, so terrified that he would hate her for not being there for him for so many years. He dropped his ramen cup as he looked at her. A single stuttering word escaped his lips, mommy. She nodded to him as she was too scared to do anything else and smiled softly at him and began to try and apologize for not being there for him, I'm so. She started but was forced to stop. A blonde bundle suddenly attached himself to her in a fierce hug. He was crying onto her shoulder as she held him there, holding him close to her and refusing to let go. She held her son close to her, refusing to let him go for anything in the world. Mommy. I knew you'd come back for me, I knew it. He said as he cried on her shoulder as the dream he had held for so many years finally came true. The third Hokage smiled, it was one of the few times in his entire life he felt like he had managed to do something truly and entirely good. And as he watched on her noticed the small black and blue-haired girl had a smile on her face and tears coming down her face. Welcome back Kushina, I get the feeling you and Naruto are going to cause a lot of trouble in the future, aren't you the Hokage thought to himself. Kushina and Naruto held each other for a long time before they finally broke the embrace and Kushina, holding Naruto in her arms, walked back to the Hokage. Hey old man. I have a mom. Naruto said with excitement the old Hokage. The Hokage chuckled at the boy, I see that, I'm glad she was able to come back to you Naruto, now why don't the three of us go and get some lunch together, it'll be your mother's first meal in a long time. Chapter 2. Return, Changes, and Memories. It was early the next morning, the light from the sun was just cresting over the forest, and quiet presided over a small apartment in Konoha. Kushina stared at the dishes before her, she had almost fainted when Naruto had shown her where he lived. She guessed that the Hokage had never told him it was the same apartment that she had been given when she came here as a refugee so long ago, or that he was using the same plates and silverware pots and pans that she had used when she lived there as well. She guessed the Hokage thought it proper that her son be given those things. She let her fingers run along the pots and pans, the plates and the counters. Her eyes drifted around the kitchen and living room as her own memories of the place filled her mind. She had wanted to make Naruto breakfast, but right now she was caught in her own mind as thoughts of her past filled her very soul. The day before Kushina had pushed the feelings coming to her and the memories aside and tried to live only in the moment to be with Naruto. She had been so caught up with finally being with her son that reality had not completely set in on her and now in the early morning quiet she was forced to face that reality. It was difficult to remember that more than 10 years had passed since her last time in this place. To her it was only weeks before when Minato had come into their home through the window and kissed her while placing his hand on her pregnant stomach and smiling. To her only a few days had passed since Naruto had been safely in her arms as an infant. And now she was standing in her old apartment, Naruto's apartment now. She had grown up in this apartment. She knew where the nooks and crannies were that she used to hide weapons, some which were probably still there. She saw the desk she had used on occasion to study was still there and knew that behind the desk drawer was a small heart with her and Minato's names from the days when she had crushed on the little boy. She giggled as she remembering having to practically scream at the man that she had liked him for years and demanded a date from her best friend. Flashback. Minato had come back from a very dangerous mission with his sensei Jiraiya. They had infiltrated a large rock village encampment along the border and managed to steal several highly classified documents containing defense layouts, troop movements and capacity. The mission had a very low survival chance, but Minato and Jiraiya had pulled it off without a scratch to show for it. Minato, I'm so glad you came back safe from your last mission. Kushina said as rushed to him hugged her friend. Minato placed a hand behind his blonde head and scratched it, returning the hug with one arm, thanks Kushi, I didn't know you cared so much, he told her sheepishly. Kushina had spent the last 2 years dropping ever-increasing hints to her best friend he needed to ask her out on a date, but he was so dense when it came to women, he never seemed to get the idea. Even when she asked his best friend Hiashi Hyuga to mention it, he had still not gotten the message. Kushina broke her embrace and glared at him, I've cared more for you than anyone else in my entire life Minato, how is you don't understand that yet? She told him with regret and anger apparent in her voice. Wait. What? I mean, anyone. Minato said as he took an involuntary step backward looking at the girl before him with wide eyes at the news. Minato Namikaze, you are the densest man in this entire world. How could you not know this? We've been best friends since we were 7 years old. She yelled at him as tears began to come down her eyes. Kushina. Why are you crying? I don't understand. Minato said alarmed by the tears. I'm crying because it's obvious you only see me as a friend and I won't ever get you to ask me out. So fine, I'm done waiting. Minato Namikaze, you have about 10 seconds to ask out the prettiest, sexiest and deadliest kunoichi in this village or I'll tell Jiraiya you secretly love his work and want to be featured in every itchy issue from this point on she told him glaring at him and placing her hands on her hips. Do you really want to date? Minato asked quietly. I've only tried to tell you this for years Minato, you'd think you would have gotten the message by now, she retorted. The next thing Kushina knew Minato had pulled her into a deep embrace and she felt tears running down his cheeks, please Kushi, go out with me, I never thought I always thought you just wanted to be my friend, you've always been there for me for years, you know me better than anyone in this world, of course I want to go out with you. My god, I can only imagine how dense any kids he has are going to be, Kushina thought with a giggle and blush. Then flashback. She had been living here when Minato had shown up for their first date, he had been dressed in black pants and a dark-colored shirt, his smile was gentle, and his hair was held back by his forehead protector. She remembered the doorbell ringing and opening it and how his jaw had dropped. She was always a tomboy when they were younger and their date was the first time she had ever worn a dress for him or anyone. Kushina had pulled out all the stops for that night, wanting him to remember that image of her forever and have it burned into his memory. She had worn a tight red kimono with a flame pattern on it which accented her curves and hair while showing plenty of leg. She had done her hair up in an elaborate braid above her head and grinned at his response, knowing she had the exact response she was looking for. Kushina smiled as she remembered that date and how he had walked her home, insisting on seeing her to her door and then getting nothing but a kiss on the cheek and an impish grin as she shut the door in his face, saying he needed to be more creative than a dinner and a movie next time. Kushina also felt the depression of knowing Minato was never coming through that door again. That she would never see his soft smile or hold his strong hands or feel his lips, it made her regret not kissing him that night. She had no idea how precious such things would be later in their lives or the sacrifices they would have to make. But she also knew she would not let her Naruto make the same mistakes when he found someone, or more likely, when she found him, as thoughts of a dark-haired girl hiding behind a tree made her smile. Finally, Kushina brought herself back to the kitchen and began to push her mind back to the present, where she began to pick up the pots and pans and turned the stove on. She had cooked for years on the stove and knew just what Naruto would like: breakfast ramen. Her secret recipe involving bacon, eggs, and ramen noodles, all soaked in fried rice and a sauce made from the ramen liquid. Memories returned as Kushina thought about how she had looked so forward to cooking breakfast for her family. She had to fight back the tears which threatened to burst from her as she was again reminded with a sharp pain to her heart she had been forced to miss 10 years of his son's life and lost the love of her life all at once. She had cooked Minato this breakfast before missions in the early morning. He would arrive an hour before they were told to leave just to help her and would also help her clean up. He loved her breakfast ramen special. She looked at the table in the room, another reminder that Minato would never sit there again, never laugh at her jokes or make her blush. She could almost see his image at the table smiling at her and laughing. The look of his eyes and his blonde hair, the way his mouth quirked upward when he was trying to hide a grin, or how he would fall to floor when he laughed with all his might. She would never see or hear that smile or laugh again, and it nearly brought Kushina to her knees. But as Kushina brought the eggs and ramen to cook, her ears caught the sound of Naruto's soft snores from the other room. The sound steadied her. She knew she would have to deal with the loss of her husband and 10 years of her life, and the person who had stolen with them would pay dearly for it, but for the moment Naruto needed her in the here and now, and that was where she would be. She remembered the day before when they had taken him to Ichiraku Ramen and had her first meal with her son. Flashback. The Hokage and Kushina walked up to Ichiraku Ramen with Naruto in her arms. She had refused to set the boy down to walk on his own and had carried him the entire way, even though the Hokage could see the strain on her face and cautioned her not to overdo it. Kushina, you need to be more careful. Even though the medics were able to help restore a lot of muscle tissue, you're still terribly weak and probably should be in the hospital resting. So please don't overexert yourself, Hiruzen told her as they arrived at the ramen stand. I know, but this was more important, Kushina told him as she watched Naruto climb into the seat and waved at the old chef and his daughter, who smiled and looked genuinely happy to see the boy. Kushina remembered the old chef and his daughter from when she and Minato had dated. The chef had been younger then and his daughter merely 3 or 4 years old at the time, but they had always been so kind to them. Kushina had found the stand when it was brand new and it had become her second home. She was not surprised that Naruto seemed as well at home here as she had. Naruto was pointing to his mother and the Hokage and speaking excitedly to the old chef and his daughter, who both had looks of shock on their faces at the boy's words before breaking into tight smiles. If this is some impostor, I'll string them up by their toes, the chef thought to himself. No one should mess with a boy like this, he gets enough from this village. While the old chef was contemplating the murder of the woman who claimed to be Naruto's mother, the Hokage and Kushina were having a quiet conversation just out of sight behind the blinds of the ramen stand. Those are 2 of the people you mentioned. You have always treated Naruto well? Kushina asked in a low voice. Hiruzen nodded. Yes, the way I understand it, they've always been very kind to Naruto and looked out for him. Kushina proceeded into the tent and smiled at the old chef, who lost all thoughts of murder immediately as he recognized Kushina Uzumaki. With her deep red hair and emerald green eyes, there was no one else in the village that could resemble her. And when she smiled, it just cemented who she was in their minds. The old chef nearly fainted from the sight of the woman he had thought was dead. It's been too long, Tucci, and it's nice to see you again, Am. You've grown into a lovely young woman. Thank you both for looking after my son for all these years I've been away, Kushina told them with a smile, even as she felt a small jab in her heart as she was again reminded of her lost time with Naruto. She took a seat beside her son, placing a hand around his shoulder and smiled lovingly at him. Heikei kushi ina yu yuzu yumaki. My god, you're back. Thank Kami. The old chef said as tears appeared in his eyes. It's so good to see you. Where have you been? You're so thin, are you sure you're okay? Well, we'll get you fed up immediately. The old chef stated, causing Kushina to giggle. The chef had already come around the counter and given Kushina a tight hug and smiled at the child next to her. I'll explain everything later, but right now I'd like to simply have lunch with my son and our family friend, she told him, gesturing to the Hokage who had seated himself on the opposite side of Naruto. Gucci nodded to Kushina as stars shone in his eyes. "I'm so glad you're back, this boy has been keeping my business afloat, but with you here as well, we'll be certain to be rich." Everyone burst out in laughter at the statement, as the Hokage thought it was probably true knowing the two ramen addicts. The old chef put a hand on Naruto's shoulder and looked at the boy. "I'm glad your mother has returned, Naruto, now you be good to her and treat her with respect and the wonderful woman she is, understand?" Naruto looked at the chef with a serious face. "Of course, it's the best gift in my entire life and I won't even want her to leave, so I'm going to be very good." The old chef smiled at the boy as he returned to his kitchen and immediately went to work providing the best ramen they could cook and even gave it all on the house. Naruto had proven he had inherited her love for ramen and she had smiled as the boy downed nearly 6 bowls without stopping. Then flashback. Kushina smiled as she remembered the day before and that evening as well. She and Naruto had walked along the streets with him holding her hand and he had told her about the things he liked and smiled so brightly at her. The Hokage had insisted she be checked again by the medics before allowing her to return home and had escorted her there himself and made sure that she was given clearance to leave before returning to his office. Secretly he also had assigned a specific Anbu to watch over the family now that Kushina had returned. He knew that no one would ever harm the two as long as Kakashi Haddock was watching over them and that Kakashi would give his life to protect them now that he knew who Naruto was thanks to Kushina's return. Flashback. Kakashi arrived as instructed by the Hokage and bowed to the old man. It was late but he didn't sleep much anymore. The toll of losing his sensei on top of everyone else in his life had taken much out of the man and even after 10 years he still had trouble sleeping through the night. Some people said he had lost his heart with the loss of the people precious to him. "Ah, Kakashi, good to see you, I have a special assignment for you," the old man told the Anbu before him. Kakashi nodded rather than speaking and waited for his instructions. "I am assuming you heard about the woman who came to my office yesterday." When Kakashi nodded the Hokage continued, "I am assigning you to protect her and her son. This is considered a Class A mission and will be your full-time job from now on." Kakashi stood stunned for a moment before finally speaking, "Lord Hokage, no offense intended, but who could possibly garner such protection and such a high-ranking mission?" "The woman was your sensei's wife, Kushina Uzumaki. We thought her dead for many years before she suddenly arrived yesterday. Most people didn't recognize her because of her condition. I have already sent several Anbu teams to attend to the matter as soon as she arrived and I realized who she was. Those responsible for her captivity will be brought to the most painful death imaginable. Her son is Naruto Uzumaki, as you probably already guessed. I am assigning this mission to you because of your outstanding record. You may use any means possible to protect them and may make contact with the family if you wish. Kakashi, you know that once word gets out, and it will if I know Kushina, your sensei's old enemies will be after Naruto and Kushina with a vengeance, not to mention the individual who held Kushina for so long. Until Kushina has completely recovered and Naruto is old enough and trained enough to take care of himself, your job will be to act as a bodyguard for the family." Kakashi was stunned for a moment and couldn't move as he felt his heart beat several times. He had not known his heart was capable of still beating like that after all this time. Kakashi had thought he had lost the ability to feel such a thing as joy or remorse due to his time in Anbu and the loss of everyone precious to him. Tears began to slip down his eyes as he realized his sensei had left him a legacy to help guard. "I will protect them, sensei, I swear it to you. I will accept, no one shall harm Kushina or Naruto under my watch, Lord Hokage. If I may request, I would also like to be one of the ones who helps execute the traitor who committed such an act on Kushina," Kakashi said as an edge of steel entered his voice, promising all forms of nasty techniques to ensure maximum pain before death. "We shall see about that, Kakashi, you'll have to get in line after Kushina and myself first though," the Hokage chuckled darkly as he had his own sadistic ideas of how to deal with Danzo. Then flashback. As evening settled they had returned to Naruto's apartment where the boy had wanted to show her some of his prized possession. While it did not surprise her that the apartment was a complete mess, she was shocked to find that Naruto's few prized possessions consisted of a small blue blanket, the one he was wrapped in at the hospital the night he was born. A small stuffed toad which looked heavily worn but cared for, and a pair of goggles he said were from a secret admirer who would sometimes leaving encouraging notes. Kushina wondered at the secret admirer but had an idea of who it might be as she remembered the small black and blue-haired girl who had been watching her son. It was obvious that at least one person in his class had cared for him even if she was unable to say so because of her shyness. "I'm going to have to ask the Hokage about her later," Kushina thought to herself. "I won't let my son act like his father and waste years they could be together if the girl loves him." Kushina had surveyed the apartment and noticed that, while a mess, it looked to be in decent shape, but she didn't understand why he only seemed to have ramen in his cupboard and some rice. Although he had some eggs and bacon in his refrigerator as well as a gallon of old milk. Naruto had been rather embarrassed to tell her he was unable to purchase anything else because the prices were too high for him, and Kushina was reminded how the villagers had treated her son and how they had completely ignored Minato's wishes. She had felt the anger at the village well up inside her and released a massive amount of killing intent towards them until she realized it was scaring Naruto and stopped. In fact, it had scared most of the village as well. She was not known as the Crimson Death without good reason. She had hugged him and promised that things were going to change and that he would never be alone. Flashback. Naruto clung the woman in front of him, his mother. He still couldn't believe she was there before him, but the old man had said she was his mother. "It'll be alright now, Naruto, I'm here and I won't ever let you be alone again. I promise things are going to change for the better. I love you, Naruto, I've loved you since before you were born and your father loved you as well. I wish he was here with us so much, he would never have allowed the village to treat you like this," Kushina told him as she hugged her son tightly. Mom, who was my dad?" Naruto asked her quietly. He had wanted to know the answer to that question for so long, and he was almost afraid to ask her, and he had spent the day building up the courage to finally ask, since he wasn't sure he wanted to know. He had always hoped his father was a great ninja hero and would come back to him someday to train him and be with him. But those dreams had mostly been crushed by the comments of the villagers. "Your mom and dad didn't want you, they left you behind cause you're worthless trash." They had told him, "Your parents didn't care about you, so they left you to plague us," was another common statement when he had asked. Naruto had cried himself to sleep many times because of the scathing comments about his parents. Kushina saw the emotional scars on her son as he asked the question, and she knew she should have told him before now, but had been too busy dealing with her own issues during the day. She was kicking herself for not telling him earlier. "Naruto, your father was my soulmate, the light in my life, and the kindest man in the world. He loved you dearly, my son, and he wanted you to be safe, so he gave his life to make sure that would happen. His name was Minato Namikaze, he was the fourth Hokage," she had told him only to hear the gasp and feel his tears press down onto her shoulder as he cried. Naruto had clung to the words of his mother, "The fourth Hokage was my dad." He thought to himself and suddenly felt bad for the times he had painted over his face as pranks. Tears began to fall down his face as he felt relief wash over him, knowing that his dad had loved him and wanted him to be safe and happy. At first she was alarmed by his tears and then realized he was happy. She never thought about how hard it must have been to not know who his parents were or if they even cared for him. She could only imagine the comments the villagers had said to her son about his father and her. The third had told her he had suppressed the information to keep Naruto safe. She had agreed with the decision but was glad she could tell him the truth and finally let him know who he was. Then flashback. Naruto had fallen asleep shortly after that and she had carried him to bed. She had fallen asleep soon after that herself with Naruto still clinging to her. She had woken this morning before dawn and quietly slipped out of bed to cook breakfast. With the Hokage's permission, Naruto was going to miss a week of school since the pair needed some time together. She heard the door open from Naruto's room as he came out. She had practically drooled at how cute he was when she saw him in his hippo pajamas. She smiled at him brightly with her entire heart in her gaze. "Good morning, my precious boy, how did you sleep?" she asked him as she made the final preparations with the meal. Naruto's eyes widened at her and he started to cry, tears streaming down his face as he responded, "Why, you're really here, wasn't it a dream?" Naruto had awoken expecting to see his empty kitchen again. He had thought finding his mother was just another dream. A good dream, but a dream, and when he saw her standing before him, he simply broke down at the joy flooding his entire being. "She's real. She didn't leave me. She's here," he thought to himself. And with that he launched himself to her and she was only barely able to move in time to catch him as he hugged her tightly. She was so shocked it took her a moment to realize he must have thought the day before was a dream and he had probably had that same dream many times before. She was saddened for a moment at the reminder again that she had 10 years of her life with him taken away. "I will kill you myself for this, Danzo," slowly filleted over an extra large skillet, she thought to herself as she comforted her son. "No honey, it wasn't a dream, I'm here to stay and I love you dearly and I won't ever leave you again," she told him in a soothing tone as he held her tightly, as if afraid if he let her go, she might disappear. Finally he let her go long enough to sit at the table where she brought 2 plates loaded with her special breakfast ramen. Naruto stared at the meal before him, the steam rising from the hot meal of fried rice, ramen noodles, eggs, and bacon all mixed together, and he started to cry again as he looked at the plate. "Is something wrong, Naru?" Kushina asked her son as she saw the tears and was concerned. "And no mom, it's just, this is my first home cooked meal and I'm just happy," he told her as the tears continued and she suddenly understood why he was crying. Naruto had spent so much of his life completely alone that finally having his mother back and having her cook breakfast like a normal mother, something that all the other kids in his class took for granted, was something he had dreamed of ever since he could remember. She smiled and a few tears came down her cheeks as well and moved closer to him and put an arm around her son and kissed his head. "Well, you better eat it before it gets cold, don't you think, Naru?" she told him. Naruto suddenly got a terrified look on his face that he was letting the first breakfast his mother had ever cooked get cold. She was so worried he wouldn't like her cooking and was watching him as his mouth surrounded the fork and he swallowed the food. Every fiber of her being was focused on this one moment. Please let him like it. Please let him like it. Kushina thought to herself as nervous butterflies found themselves in her stomach. Suddenly Naruto's face split in the biggest smile he had ever had before. "It's the best breakfast I've ever tasted, Mom. Thank you," he told her and began to dig in. Kushina could only smile at her son as relief flooded her. He liked her cooking. Her son liked her cooking. She couldn't contain the happiness as she smiled brightly as she watched him dig into his food. "Minato, he is so much like you with that smile that reminds me of the sun itself, but he has my terrible table manners," Kushina thought to herself with a giggle as she began to eat her own meal. As breakfast wound down, Kushina told him he would not be going to the academy for the rest of the week and Naruto jumped in the air with a fist and yay. Kushina chuckled and shook her head. "The reason you're not going to the academy is because we have to take care of a few family things, Naru. We need to move into our family home, deal with the resurrection of our clan, and I need to spend some time training with you as well." Naruto looked like he had been given every Christmas gift imaginable for the next century by the smile on his face. "We have a family home. And a clan. And I get to train with you, Mom. Yay. Are we going to be called Namikazes now?" he said. He jumped up and down in his seat in excitement. Kushina laughed at his antics. "Well, it's not quite as easy as that. I'm still very weak after everything that has happened and I need to get my strength back. And while the Uzumaki clan was very powerful back in the Whirlpool country, it has since been destroyed when the Whirlpool country was annexed. Your father's clan was well known and respected here in the village. We were waiting for you to be born before making our marriage official and for me to take his last name with the war finally ending. We both agreed that your father's enemies might try and attack me while I was pregnant. But I don't see any reason for us not to take his last name. I think your father would want us to. We won't hide ourselves anymore, Minato. Everyone will know who your son is and that I was the woman who finally caught the yellow flash," she thought to herself. Kakashi watched the entire scene from the window and smiled under his mask. He had been watching the pair since late last night and had slept outside their home even. It was Kushina alright. He would never forget that energetic and brash redhead that his sensei had gone to go over. He was curious about the boy, Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, huh? I wonder if you'll take after your dad, he thought to himself. While Kakashi contemplated the boy and his mother, he followed them as they made their way to the Hokage tower quietly out of sight. He hadn't made his presence known yet and was unsure whether he should or not. Part of him wanted to, but he figured he'd wait a bit and let them have some time alone first. After seeing them interact, he knew they both needed some time together, but he also wanted to help train the boy. Kushina walked into the tower like she owned the place. Even as thin as she was, a few good meals had done wonders for her sagging energy levels, and she made a mental note to remember to thank the medics again for their work to help restore her lost muscle mass. Naruto was wearing his usual orange jumpsuit and Kushina was wearing the black pants and white shirt along with the black jacket from the day before. The secretary saw her coming and opened the door, simply informing her that she was expected. Kushina entered into the office with Naruto, who smiled and immediately said, "Hey, old man." Upon entering the office, Kushina was assaulted by the expectancy of seeing Minato behind the desk. She saw him there a moment, smiling at her before the image was replaced by the old visage of the third Hokage. She shook her head as she focused on the present. Kushina sighed. "Sorry, Lord Hokage, Naruto, you need to be more respectful." She admonished him slightly, but her smile and eyes told him she approved of his nickname. The old Hokage was seated behind his desk and merely smiled and chuckled at the two of them. "I highly doubt even if you do manage to teach him proper manners he would ever call me anything else. After all, he is your and Minato's son." "You're probably right," Kushina told him with a grin. Before Kushina could say anything, the old man took out several scrolls with what looked to have blood seals on them to Kushina. She raised an eyebrow and he smiled again. "I knew you'd be coming by, so I took the liberty of gathering the scrolls with everything Minato left you and Naruto. Naruto was to receive them on his 16th birthday, but since you're back I knew you'd want them. Inside are the keys to the Namikaze estate where you both had been living, as well as several scrolls explaining the jutsu of the Namikaze clan and Minato's own techniques, and I believe personal messages for both you and Naruto," the old man told her as he motioned for her to take the scrolls before her. Kushina, please be careful, I know you want to get back into training and good shape quickly, but don't overdo things like you did when you were younger. Your body needs rest and time to regain its strength, the old Hokage reminded her as she took the scrolls and placed them into a bag she had brought. Before Kushina could respond, Naruto jumped in, I'll make sure she stays safe, old man. I won't lose her now that I finally found her. Believe it. He told him, and both mother and Hokage smiled at the boy. Lord Hokage, I intend to take my husband's name for both myself and my son, now that I've returned. I don't want us hiding anymore, she told him with the same fiery challenge which she always seemed to have about her. The Hokage sighed, I figured you would do something like that. I'd rather you didn't until you were stronger, and Naruto was a bit older though, but then I doubt that would change your mind, would it? Kushina shook her head, she was adamant, no more hiding who we are, old man. I want this village to know who we are and to make them regret the way they've treated my family and Minato's wishes. We gave everything for this village and they have returned our good faith with anger and mistreatment. I want everyone who ever treated my Naru badly to know that he was the son of their greatest hero, so they can lie awake at night from guilt. Kushina's impassioned speech would have gone over much better with the Hokage if she wasn't still thin as a rail, but he knew he couldn't stop her, so he would have to make arrangements to help her. Subtle as always, Kushina. There is nothing stopping you since the marriage and birth of Naruto were both well recorded, although kept secret at the time, he informed her. I don't think Minato would want us hiding ourselves anymore. In all honesty, it didn't work out well the first time, and I am sure we'll have enough protect soon. She told him with a grin that said she had planned this out before turning to her son, Naruto, could you step out into the waiting area for a moment so I can have a word alone with the Hokage, please? She asked her son, who nodded and left the office after he hugged her, and she promised she wouldn't leave him. He was still rather worried she might disappear if he let her out of his sight. Once the door was closed, Kushina took a deep breath and opened her eyes, which now radiated an inner fire the Hokage hadn't seen in years. She also began to release a large amount of killing intent, and her voice got very quiet and deadly. I also want you to get word to Jiraiya and Tsunade, I want them back in Konoha immediately. They both have a lot of questions to answer, and it will be a very long discussion for them, and if I can get my hands on Kakashi, I'll give him a good thrashing as well. The Hokage thought a moment, Jiraiya and Tsunade would both return immediately if they were told Kushina was still alive, and I bet she is counting on that to provide her family the added protection. Smart move, using my own students as bodyguards without their even knowing it. Kakashi, who was sitting outside the window listening to the conversation, suddenly felt himself begin to sweat. He had seen how his sensei had gotten beaten several times by Kushina and knew how tough the woman was. I think I'll wait until she's done with Jiraiya and Tsunade before I introduce myself, or maybe I should introduce myself today while she's still weak and can't hurt me as badly. Yes, that's a much better idea. Kakashi thought to himself as he watched the red-headed woman go off about how Jiraiya and Tsunade should have been there to watch over her Naruto. They were his godparents after all, and she was terribly hurt and angry they hadn't taken her son in. The old Hokage paled slightly at the woman's anger and description of what she had planned for his former students, justified as it was, and nodded through most of it before she finally calmed down and sat on a chair in his office. At least nothing is broken, I guess I should be thankful for small mercies, he thought to himself. I'll send for them at once, of course. I can't imagine they'll turn down a summons that says you're back and want to see them immediately, he told her to placate the redhead in front of him. Kushina nodded to him and smiled sweetly, thank you, Lord Hokage, and more than that, thank you for everything. I know you watched out for Naruto as much as you could through the years. That means a lot to me. I like to think of Naruto as my own grandchild, Kushina. I think Minato would have been disappointed in me if I had not done everything in my power. Please don't be too hard on Jiraiya, I saw him after what happened and I've never seen a man more broken than that. Tsunade wasn't much better. I'm not excusing them for not being there, but just don't be too hard on them, K. The old Hokage told her as he remembered how his former students had reacted to the loss of Minato and Kushina's disappearance. Jiraiya had locked himself in his apartment for nearly 2 months and he had finally had to break the door down to find the Toad Sage a mess. He hadn't showered since Minato's death, hadn't eaten, slept or anything, and Hiruzen had been forced to drag him to the hospital to force feed him as he had been starving himself to near death. Jiraiya had blamed himself for both Kushina and Minato's death. He tried to convince the man to allow him to perform the seal, but Minato had adamantly refused, claiming it was his responsibility. When Kushina had disappeared, he had blamed himself for not watching over her himself. The Hokage was fairly certain that Jiraiya had left to try and run from the reminders of what he considered his past failures. Tsunade had not been much better. She had liked Minato a lot and Kushina was like a daughter to the woman. Minato had been the one to bring Tsunade back from her drunken stupor after Dan's death. After she had learned they were both gone, she felt she had failed again to save people close to her, and it had sent her back to the Seiken gambling, and she had fled the reminders in the village of what she considered her failure save her precious people. Neither of them would have been able to care for Naruto in their mental states. Kushina nodded her head. I'll try and remember that, Lord Hokage. One other thing, the other day when you pointed out that girl watching Naruto, who was she? The old man raised an eyebrow and grinned at her. That was Hinata Hyuga, Hiashi's firstborn daughter and heiress to the Hyuga clan. From what I've heard, she's got a bit of a crush on your boy there. Of course he has no clue, and she's incredibly shy for a Hyuga. Very sweet girl, quiet, caring, very kind considering most Hyuga are cold and rather emotionless, he told her in an offhanded manner. Kushina grinned at him. Thanks, she sounds like a very nice girl, maybe I should see about setting up a playdate with Hiashi, she thought out loud. Thank you again for everything, Lord Hokage, she told him, bowing. The Hokage said he would have Naruto's things at his apartment moved to the Namikaze estate for them in the next few days, and that he had made sure the estate was sealed so all of her and Minato's things would still be there. Kushina thanked him, and they both rose to say goodbye when Kushina surprisingly hugged the old man with all the strength she had before she walked out his office and collected Naruto. Naruto smiled and jumped off the couch and ran to his mother. It's time to go home, Naruto, she told, and he smiled brightly at her. Chapter 3. Action and Knowledge. Deep beneath Konoha 15 hours prior. The sole shinobi kneeled before his leader. The shadows of the room stood entirely still as he gave his report. The coldness of the room seemed to reflect the demeanor of the occupants. The shinobi wore form-fitting black Anbu gear, and his mask carried no markings on it. His mask was white, he had not earned the right to be anything but a tool. He was not even worth having a name in the eyes of his leader. His eyes never strayed from the ground before him as his emotionless voice continued in a neutral tone, his breathing and pulse never changing. Lord Danzo, we have confirmed the report given. Kushina has been found alive and was missing from her cell in Block 18C. Team 19 was dispatched 18 hours after it appears Kushina managed her escape. It is still unclear how she managed to overcome the comatose drugs, and we were unaware due to the lockdown on information by the Hokage, as reports described the woman as have brown hair and yellowed eyes, along with being too thin to be certain it was a woman or man. Once it was confirmed it was Kushina, Uzumaki Team 19 was dispatched to obtain information and, if possible, reacquire the target, but she is now well guarded. I apologize for the delay in obtaining this information, Lord Danzo. The target was well guarded and we were only recently able to get close enough to confirm her identity. Danzo's face remained unchanged, his body never moved, and it seemed he did not even blink at the news. Nothing fazed Danzo, his heart and soul seemed to be made of stone and ice seemed to flow through his veins. His mind began to move swiftly at the thought of the implications involved in Kushina's escape. Destroy the entrance and perform sweeps through the entire base. I want an advance team sent to Route Beta to prepare the location in the event our base here is compromised. Also bring down the block surrounding that entrance, so even if they breach the entrance they won't find anything. Go. Hi. The ninja responded and vanished, leaving Danzo in the dark and now silent room. Present day. In a large casino many miles away. Tsunade Senju slammed her hands down on the table in front of her. Today wasn't going at all the way she had planned. She had been at the poker table for almost an hour and had already lost almost all her money. The slug princess of Konoha glared at the smirks on the other players and rolled up her sleeves before putting all of her remaining money on the table for one final hand before looking for store credit. The other plays chuckled, the legendary sucker was living up to her reputation, so they decided to indulge her and added their own payouts to the pile. Shizune, Tsunade's loyal apprentice, frowned and sighed as the pig in her arms drooped visibly at her master's actions. Lady Tsunade, don't you think you should save some of that? Shizune asked her sensei. But the shrugged Tsunade grinned, go big or go home. Or find more credit. A chill suddenly found its way down Tsunade's spine and an intense feeling of dread entered her mind. Something is coming and I'm not going to like it, she thought to herself. Shrugging off the feeling, she refocused her mind on the game as she suddenly found herself holding a full house. Haha. I win. Who's the sucker now? She screamed, pumping a fist into the air before suddenly stopping. Tsunade slowly turned and looked at her apprentice with a look of absolute dread. Shizune. Get the bags, we're leaving immediately. With a quick and understanding nod, Shizune left to comply immediately with her sensei's wishes as Tsunade rushed to cash out her winnings. At a large hot spring in the Earth Country. Hot springs are wonderful natural pockets of hot water which many villages have found useful for bathing and relaxing. The natural minerals were good for the skin and the steam provided a great release after a long day of hard work. Men and women alike would flock to the hot springs to simply soak and enjoy themselves as they felt their tired and sore muscles relax under the ministrations of the warm water. For one white-haired Sanin though they presented an alternative form of recreation. Jiraiya, the great toad sage, found himself amidst his favorite hobby sitting in a high tree near a well-filled hot spring. The hot spring was filled with over a dozen young women who had come to soak for the evening before returning home. Giggling like a schoolgirl, the toad sage was busy writing notes into his book as he took in the female shape before him. As he busily wrote, he was suddenly stopped as a powerful sneeze overtook him. A feeling of intense dread entered the man's senses, and he frowned to himself. I haven't had a feeling like this since Orochimaru ran off, he thought to himself, before realizing the sneeze had given away his position to the women he had been researching. In Konoha. Naruto made his way through the crowd of people before him. His hand was safely in the grip of his mother's, and he couldn't help but continue to stare at her. Everything felt different now to the young boy. Something he couldn't place his finger on felt very right. As the pair made their way through the throng of people, Naruto couldn't help but notice the expressions on their faces. They seemed shocked at his mom, like they knew her, but were surprised to see her, and several paled as if they were seeing a ghost of the past. When their gazes fell on him, they seemed too stunned at his presence at her side to even give their usual glares and curses. Some even looked to be slightly afraid of her. Kushina took the most direct route back to the small apartment to avoid as many people as possible. As Naruto entered the apartment, she dumped the scrolls on the table and swept him up in a hug with a smile. "My little Naru, everything is going to be so much better now, but we need to talk about some things first, okay?" She told him in a serious tone as her green eyes locked onto his blue ones. Naruto had little experience with mothers, but from what he had heard he was supposed to pay attention to them and listen carefully. Not having a family or a mother before, Naruto was trying hard to remember what his friend said about theirs and the way he was supposed to behave. He still held some fear that if he was bad she might disappear suddenly and leave him alone again. Kushina looked into her son's eyes and made sure he was listening very carefully before continuing, "Okay, we're going to be moving out of your apartment and into the house that your father and I lived in. The Hokage is going to send some people over to help us transport everything. We probably won't move for another day or two, but you need to understand some things that are very important. I know this might be hard for you to understand, but I don't want to hide the truth from you either. Your father and I made some very powerful enemies when we were younger, and many of them are still out there and would want to hurt us through you. That's why Lord Third never told you who we were. He was afraid if people knew they would attack before you could defend yourself." Noting the lack of expression in her son at the idea of being attacked by people, Kushina's eyes narrowed slightly. "Naruto, have you been attacked before?" she asked him. Naruto's expression became filled with shame and his eyes dropped to the floor. He took several deep breaths, and she could tell from his stance and body language he was trying to decide whether or not to answer the question. "Naruto, it's okay, I'm here now and I promise I'll protect you, but I need to know if someone's tried to hurt you," she told him, a soft and comforting voice. Taking another deep breath, Kushina's son finally responded in a quiet voice, "Yes mom, it's happened before, usually near my birthday. I don't remember much from the early times, but people would throw stuff at me, garbage, or rocks, sometimes a kunai or, shuriken. I'd get chased a lot too, and they would call me things like demon and monster. Sometimes they would break into my apartment. They would steal my things or destroy them and write things on the walls. I never understood why they did it. Did I do something wrong? I'm so glad you're here now mom." Nodding, she gathered her son in her arms and held him close. She noticed his lack of tears immediately. Kushina felt him tense for a moment before relaxing against her and wrapping his small arms around her and returning her hug. The memories of all the times he had run for his life, or he had come home to find his door and windows broken and his apartment trashed, assaulted the small boy. He had never had someone comfort him like Kushina did, and it scared him at first before he accepted the warm embrace. She then felt the warm tears fall from his eyes as he let down his guard and cried into her comforting embrace. "I can't believe what they've done to you, my son. Those bastards of a village will pay for this," Kushina thought to herself as she stoked the quiet embers of anger at the village inside her heart as she finally began to understand what her son had gone through. After several minutes of holding her son, she felt the embrace relax slightly and his tears slowed, and she smiled comfortingly to him before standing. "Everything is going to be alright from now on. No one will ever hurt you again, so long as I am here, my little Naru," she told him as she kissed her son on the cheek. Kushina then turned toward the open window in the kitchen and mentally sighed to herself. "Okay Kakashi, you might as well come on inside since I know you're there," she said in a loud voice toward the window. Kakashi winced at the voice, wondering how she had known he was there. Sheepishly he raised himself up and waved to the woman and child. Hi Kushina, long time, it's good to see you." Kakashi didn't get any further as he felt a pan slam into his face and an angry mother standing before him. "I might still be too weak to give you a good thrashing, but trust me, you and I are going to have a very long talk very soon. Now get your rear inside here and use the door, damn it," she told him as she turned on her heel and returned in the room. Grimacing at the thought of the future conversation to come, Kakashi did as he was instructed and entered the small apartment through the doorway, rather than the open window. As he entered he was tossed a box, "Since you're here to protect us, you'll also be helping us move some of the more important things, so when I give you something you pack it, got it?" Kushina told the young silver-haired jonin. Kushina, how did you know I was there and it was me? I was told you were still rather weak and would need a lot of rehabilitation before even considering resuming ninja duties." Kakashi asked carefully, wondering how the woman had managed to sense him. "There is no one else the third would trust to watch over Naruto and I grew up loving the man who trained you, remember? I know all of your tricks, Kakashi, because Minato put all his heart into training you and I knew Minato's heart better than anyone." "Naruto, this is Kakashi Haddock, he was a pupil of your father," she told her son as an introduction. Naruto, for his part, had been staring at the strange man with wide eyes before breaking into a grin and waving, "Hi. It's nice to meet you finally, I know your voice though. It's the nice dog mask man that always looked out for me when people were mean to me," Naruto informed his mother, who stopped for a moment. "You looked out for my little Naruto, Kakashi?" she asked him. "Of course, Kushina, I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't done everything I could for him," Kakashi responded with a smile under his mask, very grateful that the boy had remembered his Anbu mask from the times he had intervened with him and many civilians within Konoha. Kakashi, in truth, had recognized his sensei's son early on. It was hard to miss the resemblance after all, and had gone out of way several times to stop beatings and intervene with civilian and shinobi alike to keep the boy safe through the years. Kakashi did find it slightly upsetting that Naruto was so starved for comfort that he had remembered his voice from the times he had told the populace to leave him alone. Sighing, Kushina nodded, "You have my thanks, we'll still talk later, but it might not be as bad for you this time around as it will be for those two old students of the thirds," she told him with a deep edge to her voice, giving no question to what she had in mind for the two Sannin. The packing proceeding quickly for Naruto, Kushina, and Kakashi as Naruto didn't have much to begin with. The few items Naruto treasured were already in a small box under the hidden floorboard. They were nearly finished when several genin showed up to move all of the boxes for the family. "Good morning. May your flames of youth shine brightly," the jonin in charge yelled as he knocked on the door to the apartment. Kushina's eyes shone brightly as Kakashi felt a shiver run down his spine at the voice. Naruto looked curiously at the newcomer who announced his way into his apartment so loudly. It is so good to see you again. How have you been?" Kushina greeted the man with a hug despite his horrible jumpsuit and leg warmers. Naruto was not quite sure what to make of the tall man before him. He had black hair with a bowl cut and his eyebrows looked as if they might be alive and possible try to eat him. He wore a horrible green spandex jumpsuit which clashed terribly with his orange leg warmers and green vest. But his mother seemed to know the man and liked him, so he figured he couldn't be that bad, despite his outward appearance. "Kushina. I was in the Hokage tower moments ago when I overheard these genin were being assigned to help you move. I was so happy to hear you were alive that I insisted on coming to help the genin here move you to your new home. I can't wait to get my own squad next year and finally be able to stoke the flames of youth in their young hearts. Is that your son? He looks like a fine lad whose flames of youth burn brightly as his mother's. Do you mind if I ask, who was the father?" "I bet it was Minato," Guy told her as he gave her a wink and thumbs up with a smile so bright it hurt Naruto and Kakashi's eyes. Kushina smiled at his antics and patted him on the shoulder, "I am sure you'll be a great sensei, Guy. Just try not to overdo it, okay? And yes, this is my and Minato's son, Naruto. Naruto, I'd like you to meet Mito, Guy, one of the strongest jonin in Konoha and a good friend of mine and your father's." Naruto grinned at the green-clad man, "Hi. What's with your spandex and leg warmers, and why do you keep talking about the flam?" Naruto began, but was stopped by Kakashi's hand over his mouth and drastic motions, not to ask anything about the flames of youth. I smiled again and noticed Kakashi for the first time, and his entire demeanor seemed to go into shock. "Arg. Kakashi has beaten me here to help. Once again you prove why you are worthy to be my rival, Kakashi. Since you beat me here I will run 1000 laps around Konoha backwards on my hands." Kakashi grimaced and sighed, "Hi, Guy." Naruto pulled on his mother's pants legs, Mom, is he, sane?" Kushina giggled at her son, "Yes, Naru, Guy is very much sane and very very strong. He just overdoes things and is very excitable. But he is a good friend with a true and honest heart. He is also the best Taijutsu user in the entire village, so don't let his outward appearance or actions fool you. Since you have beaten me here to help my rival, I shall pack and move more boxes than you. It is a challenge and a contest and will put me at 37 wins to your 36. Hahaha." Guy said as he flashed another smile while Kakashi picked up another item for the box in his hands and Simple glanced over his shoulder. "Huh? Did you say something, Guy?" "Arg. Your too cool attitude will not win this contest for you. Guy told him and began to speed throughout the apartment, neatly packing everything in sight, while everyone else, including the genin, stood by and watched in amazement at the green blur. With Guy's speed and focus coupled with Naruto having few belongings of his own, the entire apartment was packed up in less than 2 hours and ready for transport to the mother and son's new home. At first Guy had insisted on carrying 4 times the load of everyone else, but Kushina managed to convince him that the genin needed some kind of work to earn their salary, to which Guy promptly agreed, much to the genin's disappointment. Hokage Tower. As the small group made their way through the roads of Konoha in the early afternoon, together the third Hokage was listening to a report given by an unusual informant. "Okay Jigjig, you and your team mapped the entire structure and are prepared?" The old man asked the leader of the team in front of him. The third Hokage listened to the report as he looked over the map laid out on his desk. If the map was any indication, there were networks of tunnels, training areas, cell block housing, medical facilities, storage units, and a large number of previously unknown structures built directly beneath the entire village. They were buried deep underground and obviously had taken a lot of time to build, but what shocked Hiruzen the most was that it spanned almost the entire length and width of the village. "Yes sir, we did as requested and entered the underground base through the doorway. The entrance was right where you said it was, in the old wing of the hospital. My team proceeded to split up and we each mapped out a section of the underground facility. As the map indicates, the structure beneath us is huge, but it seems sparsely inhabited. We only found small sections actually used by people, while other areas, unused right now, seem to show prior use with varying states of unuse. It looks like whoever is down there moves frequently to different parts of the base, probably to help avoid detection," Jigjig responded to the Hokage's question. Jigjig, like most of his team, was a small monkey and stood only about a foot tall, and his voice was a high-pitched squeak. He had dark brown fur which lightened somewhat near his head, and his tail was currently curled behind his back as he attempted to stand straighter to give the impression of greater height. As leader, he wore a black vest around his torso and, like the other members of his squad, had a Konoha hit I-8, his being placed around his waist. Hiruzen nodded to the monkey. "I agree, and I am aware of who it is down there, although I did not expect his operations to be so extensive. Is your team prepared to move out and lead Anbu units to the targets?" Jigjig gave an affirmative response, and Hiruzen nodded. The ninja monkeys vanished to meet their respective Anbu teams. "I never expected you to sink this low, Danzo," Hiruzen thought to himself. "At one time I would have let our old bonds hold me back, but I have seen we're waiting and allowing a snake to live leads in life. I won't let it happen again." Near the Namikaze estate. "It's obvious Naruto hasn't received near the level of training or help he needed, and I plan to rectify that immediately. It is disgraceful the way the instructors at the academy have neglected my son's training. By the way, Kakashi, you will be moving in with us to provide protection and help both Naruto and I train," Kushina informed the Jonin, who promptly tripped and landed on his face. "Your flames of youth are so strong, Lady Kushina. Mido Guy. Shall pledge myself to helping you obtain your goal and offer my services in training both you in your recovery and your son in his goal to become a great shinobi," Guy told her as he threw up the boxes, struck a pose with his thumb out, and then broke the pose in time to catch the boxes he had tossed into the air. Kushina thanked Guy as Kakashi recovered from his fall and looked at her sheepishly. Kushina, I do have my own apartment. Why don't I just come by when you need help?" He told her, thinking of his precious Icha collection and not wanting to subject it to the risks of travel. "It's only temporary, I already spoke to the Hokage about it and he agrees. Until I am back up to my full strength we need someone we can trust to help us and protect us. Once word gets out about Naruto's heritage and who my husband was, his enemies will come for Naruto and I. I simply want you there for the next few months or until I get those two good-for-nothing godparents back here," Kushina explained as Kakashi nodded, relieved that the arrangement would only be temporary and grateful for Jiraiya and Tsunade being the current focus of Kushina's wrath. The group had left the main roads of Konoha nearly 15 minutes before and begun to walk through a rather quiet part of the town. The houses seemed older here and were larger than the genin, and even the jonin were used too, but they stood oddly silent. I looked around in amazement. I don't ever remember this section of Konoha, and I've run through every inch of it on both my feet and my hands. Where are we? Kushina gave a small smile. There are 2 sections of the city which almost no one visits anymore. The first is the Senju district, which is locked and protected by special wood jutsus, and only Tsunade can enter without fear. The second is the Namikaze district, which is where we are now. The Namikaze clan were geniuses with space and time jutsus, as seen by my husband's Hiroshin technique. One of the clan's greatest achievements was to take their entire district and place a space and time jutsu on it, which causes the entrance to the district to be hidden from sight. The district is only accessible to those of Namikaze blood or those who have a special key like the one I am carrying right now. The jutsu creates a bubble around the district itself, so it is still very much part of Konoha, but if you were to walk into an entrance of the district you would simply walk through it, passing through the entire district with a single step. If you have a key or Namika's blood you would activate a market in the jutsu which would let you enter. Kakashi, Guy, Naruto and the genin looked on in wonder at the unknown district of Konoha. The Namikas were considered masters of space-time, signless jutsus, and some of the greatest seal masters in the world. The district was obviously very old and showed signs of being uninhabited for a long time. There were stores and houses everywhere, blacksmith shops, grocery stores, weapons stores, mail stations, police stations, even a family library and hospital. Everything was covered with the Namika's clan symbol, a bright flame pattern spiraling outward from the center in a brilliant flash of color. Or it would have been a brilliant flash of color if the flags and clan symbols weren't faded to a dull brownish gray from time and carried many holes and tears in them from the weather. The shops varied in construction from those of brick and mortar to wooden structures. The houses ranged from small apartment complexes with little space to the larger more ornate with columns and fields for yards. Yet they all showed the signs of the passage of time heavily. Several had collapsed roofs and carried dust which was inches thick. The houses were in better shape simply because they seemed to be constructed better than the shops. The library and hospital showed they had been carefully put away and sealed to avoid the damage of time. Kushina's eyes glazed over and again she saw Minato with every turn. His smiling confident face telling her how they would have a large family and how the district would one day again be filled with smiling faces as their children and great-grandchildren brought life back to the Namika's district. She had smiled and laughed at his enthusiasm, she missed that smile of his so much. She saw him standing there pointing to something and she began to walk toward him when Kakashi put a hand on her shoulder. "There are a lot of ghosts in this place, are you sure you want to stay here, Kushina?" Kakashi asked her quietly. Kushina shook her head to clear it as the vision of Minato again faded from her sights and righted her course toward the main Namika's house. "It would be what Minato would want and we are safest here." It's sad, at one time this district was open to the entire village to see and visit, much like the Senju and Uchiha districts, anyone could come and go as they pleased. But as the wars pressed in and their numbers dwindled from assassinations and being targeted by enemies from both outside and inside Konoha, the Namikas became paranoid and sealed away their home in hopes of providing themselves with at least some measure of safety. Sadly, it didn't stop them from nearly being wiped out during the Second Great War, leaving only a handful remaining, mostly elders and a few children. Eventually only Minato was left. Naruto had been in such awe at the sight of the district and listening to his mother that his mind simply couldn't process everything fast enough for him to also speak. He felt so excited to be somewhere that felt like home to him and with people who cared about him. The more they continued the more Naruto felt like he was in a dream world. He had his own clan. His clan had a district. An entire district to themselves. He wanted to run everywhere and see everything, but he restrained himself next to his mother carrying the bags full of his clothes. "Mom, why did everyone hate the Namikas so much?" Naruto asked her wondering why his his clan would be hated so much. Kushina looked at her son and sighed, the Namikas were a very powerful clan, much like the Uzumaki were at one time. But power creates fear in others who either want to maintain their own power or take it for themselves. The other villages hated the Namikas because they were so dangerous in battle, while their fellow Konoha clans hated them because they were their rivals for prestige and power within the village. Naruto nodded even though he did not really understand all of it, and Kushina knew that. Politics was another subject she would have to teach her son. She sighed again at the thought of how far behind her son was in his education, thanks to the academy professors. Another group of people she would have to add to her list to pay a visit with once she was fully recovered. It took the group another half an hour of walking before they entered the main compound of the Namika's clan. Calling the structure a house simply wouldn't do it justice, it was a mansion. There were several acres of what were once kept fields and trees, and the house itself was 3 stories tall and obviously could fit 100 people easily. As the group looked at the structure Kushina spoke up again, it was originally designed around the same concept as the Hyuga compound where the family would live together, but over the years only the clan leader's family ever truly had stayed there and the older sections have been demolished to save space. The Namikas were never really conformists like the Hyuga, and the idea of every family living under one roof didn't work for them, so they gave up on it early after their move to the village. So they didn't expand the main compound house and eventually shrunk it some, she explained to them. As the group entered the grounds they saw how badly overgrown it was from nearly 10 years of neglect. The trees had left enormous piles of leaves on the knee-high grass, and the flowers had long since been chocked by the weeds. Kushina was again assaulted by her memories of Minato and this place. He had brought her here for their 1-year anniversary and given her a key to the district. She even now saw him standing by the flowers which had long since died, telling her his goal was to one day bring the jutsu surrounding the district down to once again allow his clan to be one with Konoha rather than hidden. Kushina had to shake her head as they reached the doorway to the house. "Thanks, you can leave the stuff there, Naruto, Kakashi, and I will get it the rest of the way," she informed them with a smile. I nodded and the genin set down their packages and stood at ease, while Kushina gave Guy a key to enter the compound for training each day with Naruto and herself in the morning and evenings. As Guy ran the genins back out toward the exit of the district, Kushina hugged her son and whispered to him, "Welcome home, Naruto." Chapter 4. Sanins and Recovery. That evening. Danzo had always considered his route to be the elite of the elite, silent, emotionless killers who obeyed his every command without question. Only a few Root were even allowed to have names or personal symbols, and they were the oldest members of Root and proven themselves beyond any doubt of loyalty. All Root shinobi were trained from birth to be emotionless killers. They had no hearts, they had no emotions, and they had no doubts. Such things were considered weakness to Root, and it was their lack of this baggage that made them the elite. Danzo had always considered his old teammate weak and always believed he should have been made Hokage, not Hiruzen. Under his rule, Konoha would have ruled the other shinobi villages with an iron fist. They would have entered a golden age where the leaf would have crushed their opponents without mercy. But no, the Nidaime Hokage had chosen Hiruzen to be his successor, and Danzo had been left with no choice but to found Root, and when Root had been officially shut down years ago for what many considered inhuman training methods, Danzo had secretly continued the organization. Danzo stood within the depths of his Root headquarters. It was the most secure location in the entire underground complex, and with him were his two more trusted bodyguards. Danzo had believed his Root to be the elite of the elite, that Hiruzen Sarutobi was weak, and that no one but he had the will to do what was necessary for Konoha. Danzo was wrong. Even now he heard the sounds of explosions as hundreds of Konoha Anbu were proceeding through his Root complex, killing his soldiers without regard. Anger crossed his features as he nodded to his bodyguards. Relay orders that all Root operatives are to fight to the last and to kill as many Konoha Anbu as possible. Tell the instructors to kill their students. And set off the bombs. I want the entire complex destroyed. Leave nothing for the Hokage to find. Danzo told his guard wearing a mask of a wolf who nodded and relayed the orders. You may attack me, you may destroy this base, but you will get nothing from it, Hiruzen. I thought this day might come and have planned for it. I will return one day and I will be Hokage, either by acceptance or by force. Danzo thought to himself coldly as he nodded to his bodyguards. Danzo pushed a small stone in the wall of his office. The stone sunk into the rock, causing the wall to give way and slide backwards. Mechanisms behind the wall went to work, and the wall slid noiselessly out of the way to reveal a tunnel leading away from Konoha. Once the three were through, the wall returned to its former position, and paper bombs surrounding the tunnel around the wall exploded, destroying any indication of a tunnel behind the wall. Danzo did not look back, nor did he mourn the loss of his troops. They were tools, and this was merely a setback for the man. A major setback perhaps, but nothing more than a setback. He would not be stopped no matter the cost. 2 hours earlier. Jigjig and his squad had broken up to meet the Konoha Anbu they were to lead. He was with Squad 4, which consisted of nearly 24 Anbu or 8 squads. There were nearly 300 Anbu involved in total, and each was to take out a specific section of the complex. Jigjig had informed them of the bombs laid within the structure, meant to bring the entire complex down, should they not move quickly enough, but that was not his concern. Okay, it's time, blow the door and move out. Squad 4's leader called out. She wore a mask and standard Anbu gear, with the only distinguishing feature being her long purple hair. The squad set off the small paper bombs which opened the doorway to the underground lair of Root and entered. They moved swiftly and silently, having planned out what target each squad would take in advance. 3 squads took off down a corridor to the right where there was little light to secure that section's power generator. Another 3 squads moved to a corridor on the left to hit an information center. The remaining 2 squads moved toward a cell block where trainees were being kept. They met light resistance at first. The only ones to respond were the guards who had been stationed at the children's cell block, and they went down quickly before they realized they were under attack. The main Root forces had been initially called to deal with the other groups moved toward the more vital nerves points of the Root complex. Okay, secure the children and prepare them for transport. We need to make this quick before they realize several squads have broken off to recover the children. If they find out, they will likely try and kill them rather than allow us to take them, the squad leader told the others. They began to open the cell doors only to find something of nightmares. There were nearly 40 children here ranging from ages 2 to 8 years old, and they all looked like starved statues. Their bodies carried many deep scars and obviously untreated open wounds. Several wounds were reddened, and pus almost bubbled out of the torn flesh, clear signs of infection. Others looked to have broken bones which had not been repaired properly, if at all, causing joints or limbs to jut out in odd angles. Their bodies looked ready to fall down from exhaustion and malnutrition, but they still stood there at rigid attention, if they could stand at all. But the worst was their eyes. They were cold, emotionless, and dead. It was as if they had already expected death and accepted it without question. The Anbu realized what they were seeing, these were Danzo's rejects. The Anbu pushed their emotions aside. The sight of these destroyed husks was too much even for their calloused souls, and it took great control to suppress the anger that rose in their hearts. Several thought of their own families and realized how lucky they were that Danzo had never been allowed to become Hokage. It served a gruesome reminder and warning of what a madman without morals would do if given a chance. Listen up, we're here to get you out of this place. You will follow us and be moved to a secure location outside of this complex. Should you threaten or attack us, we will kill you without question. Please assist one another and move in an orderly fashion, do you understand? The purple-haired Anbu kept a tight rein on her emotions as she spoke to the children, who responded with a single hi. Then began to execute her orders. The children moved like machines without thought. It was unnerving how silent they were. They were so broken, so mentally conditioned, that even being told they were being granted freedom had no impact on their minds. They merely followed orders without thought or will. Elsewhere in the complex, other Anbu unit wasn't having nearly such an easy time. They had encountered heavier resistance as they moved into the several laboratories and information centers. The laboratories were well lit, clean, and furnished with the most advanced equipment available. But there had been nearly a dozen root members attempting to stop them from entering the location. The battle had been thankfully short but fierce. Once again, the element of surprise had given the Anbu a much-needed advantage, and the root had lost half of their number in the initial assault and were quickly overwhelmed thereafter. The scientists working in the labs were either captured or killed, depending on their choice. Anbu members cared little if they chose death after they viewed the labs, and it was only straight control by their captains that kept the entire situations from becoming a mass murder and bloodbath. Inside the laboratory, they saw dozens of large tubes with what looked like children inside. Most of the tubes looked to be of deceased, but a few were still lit from within. Hard monitors beeped steadily at brightly lit control consoles connected to these lit tubes. These children looked to be connected to feeding tubes and breathing apparatus. They were thankfully silent and didn't move, but that was almost eerier than if they had begged for release from their prisons. They immediately began downloads of all the files in the system to be taken back to Intel headquarters. The things inside the tubes were monstrous creations of science. Many had extra eyes or limbs. Some had more than one head or gills or carried scales or tails. Looking at the dead creatures made even the Anbu's skin crawl, and they focused on their work to leave the place as quickly as possible. The green solution in which the bodies were kept added an eerie glow to the lab, which was otherwise very clean and smelled of antiseptic. It was like walking into a modern lab inside the research and development department, but one with no morals or qualms of human or child safety. The same scene was repeated throughout the entire complex as 100 Anbu squads entered from 10 different locations around the village and attacked the root complex. Root lacked the numbers to hold against a foe with their forces spread so thin. And with the element of surprise on their side, the Anbu units quickly decimated the initial root forces. In short order, root began to retreat to protect the heart of their base when the orders finally came to hold their positions and die to the last. And die the root members did. By this time only the heart of the complex had been taken, and it was too late to set off the final dead switch to bring down the complex. Several squads had located and cut the lines which would send the signal to the bombs in the other areas of the complex within the first 5 minutes of the initial assault. Root had never expected such a quick or deadly assault from the Konoha Anbu. Within 3 hours the entire fight was over and the remaining root forces had been wiped out, but Danzo had escaped. Hokage Tower 3 hours 30 minutes after root assault. Several Anbu stood before the Hokage. It was late in the evening, nearing 1 in the morning. The assault had taken place when their information said the guards would be nearing shift changes and be tired and more likely caught unaware. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat at his desk. He looked and felt older this evening than he had in years. Each day it seemed his robes were looser, his burden heavier, and his body all the more exhausted. This night reminded him of many of the hard decisions he had been forced to make over the years. The defection of Orochimaru, the slaughter of the Uchiha clan, the Kyuubi attack, and now the fall of his old comrade Danzo. Smoke left his pipe as he listened carefully to the report from his Anbu. "Sir, squads breached the entrance to the root complex approximately 3.5 hours ago. We met little resistance and were quickly able to kill their initial guards and secure 80% of primary targets and 60% of secondary targets before their response came within the first 20 minutes. We lost 6 squads in their counterattack. As our information said, root itself was not very large and it seemed smaller than intel suggested. With their initial numbers already decreased from our first assault, their remaining forces lacked the strength to repel us and were pushed back to the heart of their complex. They fought to the death there and only a few were captured. Most preformed a suicide jutsu before we could take them, and those in custody are being kept unconscious until we can stop them from doing the same. Danzo was not among the dead. We believe he took a portion of root forces and fled. We were able to recover 243 children ages ranging from 2 to 12 years and secured all medical data and information. Intel is currently working to decode the data now, and the remaining Anbu forces are dismantling their systems as we speak. Once everything is clear, we will bring down the complex one section at a time in a safe manner as ordered, but it will take some time. The Hokage before them nodded. I want a full report on my desk by morning and make sure those children are kept safe and under secure watch. We don't know what Danzo may have done to them, so until they have a full medical evaluation including a psychological exam by Inoichi, I don't want them unguarded. Hi. His Anbu responded before disappearing. I didn't expect you to go down easily, Danzo, but to think you were scalping the orphanages for children for your sadistic experiments is unthinkable, Hiruzen thought to himself as he rose to leave for his own home. Several days later. On a road heading in the opposite direction of Konoha, Tsunade Senju, Slug Princess and Sanin, suddenly found herself staring at a small dark-haired monkey wearing a fez. The monkey removed his fez and bowed to the blonde woman before speaking. Tsunade Senju? Wow, you sure haven't changed much. I have a message for you from your sensei. The chimp told her as he tossed a small scroll to the woman. But the short bow the chimp vanished in a puff of smoke. Tsunade held the scroll a moment, debating on whether to open the scroll or not before sighing in resignation. Whatever her sensei had that was so important as to send one of his summons to find her must be important. Biting her thumb, she swiped a little blood on the seal to open the message. What she read made her drop the scroll in shock. Shizune managed to catch her mentor before she fell to the ground as her legs gave out underneath her and drag her to the shade of a nearby tree. Tsunade. Ma'am, what's wrong? What did the message say? Shizune asked with concern evident in her voice. Tsunade shook her head and took several deep breaths before responding, Shizune, we have to go back to Konoha. Shizune nearly fell over in shock, she never thought Tsunade would say those words. Wondering what could possibly be so important to as to draw her mentor back to her home village, Shizune picked up the small scroll. Tsunade. I hope this message reaches you soon and I will be short and to the point. You must return to Konoha immediately. Kushina Uzumaki has suddenly reappeared. She has asked you to return immediately to aid in her physical recovery. I will explain everything when I see you. Here's in Saratobi. Kushina Uzumaki? I thought she died in childbirth along with her son. Shizune asked as Tsunade recovered enough to rise to her feet. I thought she did as well, Tsunade told her before shaking her head, and what is this about needing help for a physical recovery? We need to make best time back to Konoha. I need to find out what is going on. Kushina was a dear friend. I thought both she and Minato died that night along with their son. Shizune nodded to her mentor and turned her head back down the road they had just come from and sighing in resignation before following Tsunade, who had taken off at full speed back toward the place she had moments ago been fleeing from. A day later in Sunagakure. A small chimp wearing a green fez ran through the streets of the village looking for his target. The white-haired Sanin Jiraiya had been last said to be traveling towards Suna to meet a contact but had not been heard from since. The chimp sighed again as he tried to find his target in the huge village and again wished he hadn't lost a game of rock, paper, scissors to go after Tsunade instead. The chimp had already visited the local bars and casinos and even stopped for a peek into the brothel but had not seen Jiraiya any place. Suna was a large village, almost the same size as Konoha, but it was built completely differently. Unlike Konoha, which in many cases seemed like a mixed match of different districts and clan compounds, Suna was much more uniform. The entire village was built within a large valley caught between two mountain mesas. It made for a very defensible position with only one main entrance in and out of the village visible to outsiders. The structures within were built mostly from sandstone reinforced with chakra and a special mortar paste they had created to strengthen the structures. The entire village was built around the idea of defense, so every roof contained flat roofs with small aqueduct systems built into them to collect rainwater and store it within the city's reservoir. If one were to look at the builds closely, they would also notice they tended to rise higher and higher ever so slightly as they neared the Kazekage Tower in the center of the village. This was to give the home shinobi the advantage in hide in battle should they be pushed back within the village. Color wasn't a common sight in a village built of stone and sand mortar. Typically the only color to be found was inside the houses, while the outside of the buildings were more normally a golden dust color which glowed during the sunrises and sunsets of the deserts. It gave an almost magically appearance to outside visitors who would stop and stare as the sun set the buildings ablaze in golden glory. Unlike Konoha, which was typically separated into districts and clan compounds, Tsunade was built in a much more open manner. The clans typically had large clan houses rather than compounds and were much more connected to the populace. Where many of the clans of Konoha, such as the Hyuga and Uchiha, would seal themselves away, the Tsunade clans typically intermingled to a much greater degree. This was mostly caused by the necessity of being in a confined space rather than choice, as many of the clans maintained their superiority, much like their Konoha cousins. Currently, the small chimp in the green fez was making his way on a side alley toward what was commonly seen as the Tsunade Bazaar's black market. After checking the usual places where Jiraiya would be found, he decided the next place the Sannin might be would be in the black market, where he could gather information easily from the seedier elements of the great village's underground. It didn't take long for the chimp to locate the so-called black market. Tsunade may be a great shinobi village, but it was commonly understood that the black market provided them with a large supply of information and specialty items not commonly found in the main bazaar. Because of this, many of the more powerful clan and civilian leadership considered it to be useful and, while not openly assisting, tended to turn a blind eye to their activities. As the chimp entered the black market, he was surprised to find what appeared on the outside to be nothing more than another section of the bazaar. He jumped along the tops of the stands and saw nothing out of the ordinary and was extremely confused. None of the merchants were selling anything strange or looked different. It wasn't until some hours later when he saw several masked men wearing dark-colored robes appear from a cellar door from the back of a merchant's shop that he understood. The black market was not found in the open street or inside any of the merchant shops, but was in fact a large hollowed-out cavern beneath the bazaar section of Tsunade. The chimp quietly entered a shop and slipped into the door, following a young man of obviously wealth inside the cavern. Once down in the depths of the black market, it didn't take long for the chimp to locate his target. The cavern was brightly lit with torches and glowing stones, and merchants didn't speak to any but those who came to them. It was interesting to watch the exchanges taking place here. An interested party would walk to the merchant and, without a word, hand him a certain amount of ryu. Once the merchant had the ryu in hand, they would nod and invite the interested party inside their shop. If the party chose not to buy anything, they would leave, ryu not in hand, as payment for seeing the merchandise and the risk of the merchant himself. If they chose to buy the item, the already paid ryu went toward the purchase. Everything was done with minimal talk, and their discussions were conducted in separate rooms from the merchandise. It was in one of these rooms where Jiraiya was currently located. He was speaking quietly to someone in a large dark blue robe who had a mask on to cover his or her face and a hood up to avoid giving away any features. If anyone were to look, they would not be able to tell even the gender of the man sitting with the toad sage. The chimp sighed to himself and waited for the Sannin to complete whatever task he was about before delivering his message. Many people only ever viewed Jiraiya as the super pervert he wanted them to see. What was underneath the guise of the pervert was something else entirely. Jiraiya was Konoha's spy master, and he got the job not because of his connection to the 3rd and 4th Hokages. He got it because he was extremely good at it. As the chimp observed, Jiraiya spoke quietly, listened closely, and never once let his guard down. He never made a joke or perverted comment, he was all business here. His eyes and his movements were precise, and his ears trained to listen not only to the robed man before him, but also every noise around. By the end of the conversation, Jiraiya handed over a bag to the person, who nodded after taking a look inside and giving him a scroll in exchange, and silently disappeared through another door in the room. The chimp rushed to follow as the white-haired Sannin moved swiftly and almost undetectably through the underground. He seemed to pass through the shadows and light as if he was part of them. It didn't take long for Jiraiya to exit the black market, and when the chimp exited, he found himself grabbed by the back of the neck and pulled upward. "Well, my little friend, I know you have to be one of Sensei's summons, or else you wouldn't be following me with such poor skill. It's not safe to try and catch Jiraiya, the legendary Sannin and Toad Sage, unaware. Now, why don't you tell me why you're following me, huh?" The white-haired old man grinned at the small monkey in his hand, who looked as if he was about to have a heart attack. Without a word, he handed over the scroll to the old man, who nodded his thanks and, after swiping a bit of blood over the seal, opened the scroll and read its contents. As he read the scroll, Jiraiya's eyes went wide and his face began to pale. He looked for the chimp, but he had already vanished in a soft poof of smoke. With a soft sigh, Jiraiya decided sake was needed, and lots of it. "I am in so much trouble now," Jiraiya said softly as he looked for the nearest bar. 10 days after Kushina's return, Naruto had found his new home filled with wonder and beauty. The main house of the Namikaze clan had been built when their clan had first entered Konoha. It was built around the idea of symmetry and seals. The building was 3 stories high and held within it a huge reservoir of knowledge, history, and pride. The build was a gray stone with marble floors in the hallways rather than wood. It had 8 large pure marble columns out front on a large porch open toward the rising sun. The building was built in an odd shape. After asking why it wasn't square or rectangular, Kushina explained to Naruto that the home itself was built in the shape of a symbol. It was a grand idea that the Namikaze clan had when they first moved here. They wanted to make their house also a seal which would grant it extra protection against intruders and cut down on upkeep. It was a massive undertaking and experimentation. They used stone rather than wood because it was easier to ground it and it was more permanent with less chance of bending or moving over time. They then laid chakra pathways through the marble and stone of the house, almost like a chakra network. This network runs through the entire house and everything on the grounds including the gardens and monuments along the walls, Kushina had explained to him. When Naruto had asked if they had been successful, Kushina had explained the experiment was a partial success. After taking nearly a decade to complete, the house maintained a complete chakra network that was self-perpetuating through the energy within the ground. It meant that the stone and anything connected directly to the house, including painting, books, gardens, etc., would never fade or wear with time. The house itself would continuously regenerate itself. However, while the house could detect intruders, the defensive portion of their experiment had failed. They had hoped to make it so the house could produce massive genjutsus and perhaps ninjutsus at their command in case of emergency, but none had been successful. Although the active defenses had never worked, the clan found themselves in shock one day when the house was able to regenerate slowly after a portion had been struck by lightning from a storm. It was a slow process, but the stone itself actually had rebuilt itself. This odd side effect had never been explained. The first floor consisted of a massive kitchen, family library, a large bathing area and several training areas for the family. The second floor held family rooms complete with museums of clan artifacts and the main bedrooms for the permanent residents. The third floor was entirely taken up by dozens of guest rooms, such as the one where Kakashi was currently residing. The house was covered in seals, both seen and unseen, along with painting, banners, weapons, books, and odds and ends collected by the Namikaze clan over their history. Kushina had taken the first 4 days to rest and gain much needed weight to her frame. Guy had come over the next morning and promptly told Kushina to eat. It was a surprisingly revelation to everyone that Guy was a gourmet chef. He explained that being a taijutsu specialist meant he had to watch his diet, and since most of the restaurants in town could not provide the specialty diet he needed, he had been forced to learn how to cook. And, being Guy, he had done it with his usual gusto and pushed himself to be the best chef he could. While eating breakfast, he had told Kushina that for the first few days he would be feeding her every 3 hours and spend the time between doing yoga forms to restore her flexibility and small amount of tone while getting her weight back up. Guy explained that they would need to take her recovery very slowly and only once she had gained enough weight would she be able to start light workouts. So it was that for the first 4 days Guy would stuff Kushina, Naruto, and Kakashi, who was forced to admit that Guy was a better chef than him, with delicious high-protein meals every 3 hours, then take Kushina to perform yoga. He checked her weight and muscle mass every morning and evening to be sure she was gaining weight, which she did quickly thanks to Guy's special meal program. After 5 days, Guy had said they could begin doing very light workouts. Kushina would awaken 1 hour before the sun, drag Naruto out of bed, kick Kakashi out of his bed, and meet Guy and Kakashi at one of the family's training fields. They then went through 15 minutes of stretching, 30 minutes of yoga, half an hour of extremely light warm-ups, a short run, and proceeded to combat forms. Kushina realized her limitations quickly the first morning when she attempted to run against Guy's advice. She was exhausted after the initial run that had not even reached a quarter of a mile. She had attempted to ignore the exhaustion and continue the run, but Guy had stopped her. He reminded her that if she wasn't careful she could set her own recovery back by months and had her walk the remainder of the distance to complete only a single mile. Guy tended to be extremely strict with his patient and continued the regimen of 3 meals a day, although he altered them slightly to be a bit smaller and in line with the changes in the workout. After the warm-up was done, usually as the sun was just cresting the hill, they began their morning workout. There was no sparring, except for between Kakashi and Guy once, and the entire morning tended to be devoted to forms. Kushina's body remembered the forms, but its inactivity had sapped it the familiarity which all ninja required in order to survive. She was forced to concentrate on every move and force her limbs, fingers, and body to move properly. But even with the intense concentration she had, Guy found many problems and quickly corrected her. Guy was quick to correct issues in Kushina's forms as she attempted to slowly move from one to another, often having her start back at the beginning. In the afternoon, Guy would make sure Kushina rested for at least 2 hours before taking her to the lake within the Namikaze district. Swimming, he told her, would help her regain muscle mass and tone very quickly and be the easiest on her body. So in the late afternoon Kushina would often be found doing odd exercises in the water under Guy's watchful eyes. Once that was finished they would break for dinner and relax from the day as Guy and Kakashi told stories to Naruto and brought Kushina up to date on what had been happening for the past 10 years. Naruto was another problem entirely. He was full of energy, but it was obvious from the start he lacked any kind of proper training. Kakashi was the one who endured most of Naruto's banter. Kushina gave Kakashi vicious grins as Naruto followed the older shinobi around like a younger brother pestering him. Kakashi privately thought she planned this as part of her revenge for him not being more involved in Naruto's life. Naruto had never been trained in combat forms properly from the start and had no style of his own. All three adults were appalled the first time he attempted to do the basic combat moves. Kakashi's mouth dropped and Guy nearly wept at the sight of such poorly kept flames of youth, barred so early by lack of instruction from reaching their phoenix zenith. Thus, Naruto wasn't allowed to do the forms yet and had spent the entire time working with either Guy or Kakashi in understanding the reasons behind the forms and how they worked with the muscles, tendons, bones, and the theory behind using different styles and techniques in fighting. He was even given a massive amount of reading and homework, much to his dismay which Kakashi, Guy, and Kushina were all forced to endure. But why can't I do the exercises yet? Naruto asked again when Kakashi told him he would not be joining his mother or Guy to work on combat forms that morning. Kakashi sighed, Naruto, you know why, we've explained it several times before, but let's try an example this time you might understand better, Raymond. At the magic work Naruto perked up and Kakashi knew he had the boy's full attention. They had quickly learned that if they gave an example using ramen or another of his favorite food, Naruto would understand the concepts much quicker. Okay, what would happen if you tried to eat ramen raw? Would it taste good? Kakashi asked the boy. Well, I've done it several times and it tastes okay I guess, Naruto responded. Okay, but what happens if you add hot water to the ramen, doesn't it taste better? Kakashi asked again. Well, of course, ramen is always better if you let it have hot water, Naruto responded promptly. Good, now why is that? Because the hot water makes the noodles soft and lets the seasoning soak into the water to make broth and coat the noodles, Naruto said as he felt his stomach begin to hunger. Deciding that if he didn't wrap it up soon he might lose Naruto to dreams of ramen, Kakashi began to explain the meaning behind the questions. Now, the knowledge you're gaining is like that hot water. Without it you can fight, but you won't be nearly as good with it because it allows you to be seasoned, so to speak, and gives your fighting ability a greater impact. Knowing where and how to throw a punch is just as important as the strength and speed. But every true shinobi understands the reason behind why you can throw that punch, what muscles are used, and which tendons allow that movement. If you know that then you know also what muscles and tendons your opponent is using. Once you know this you can attack the weak points in the defense that much easier. Just like once the hot water is added the seasoning is spread over and incorporated into the noodles. Makes sense. Naruto had giant ramen bowls in his eyes but nodded and sat down to take notes as Kakashi began to lecture about muscular and skeletal makeup and use in basic shinobi combat forms. Kakashi had never been a very good teacher and, in truth, if it wasn't for the fact that Naruto and Kushina were his sensei's family, he would never have been willing to even do this much. But he felt he owed it to his sensei, and he had to admit that Kushina was pretty scary when she got angry. What surprised him more than anything was Naruto. The boy had obviously never been trained properly and from the looks of it had been trained improperly on purpose. His movements were completely wrong and he left wide open gaps in his defenses. On the first day they had asked him about it and he had said his instructors at the academy had told him he was different and that those movements were correct for him. It had taken the combined might of Kakashi and Guy to stop Kushina from attacking the entire ninja academy. Yet while Naruto had never been trained properly, he quickly picked up the knowledge and absorbed it like a sponge under Kakashi and Guy's instructions. He wasn't afraid of hard work, in fact he seemed to thrive on it. He was very loud and whined a lot about the books he was required to read, having come to the conclusion they were boring and the lack of actual physical combat, but once he started on the subject and was receiving instruction, he quieted up and listened attentively enough. Kakashi had only caught him napping in his lecture once and even had to admit it was a rather boring part that had almost put himself to sleep. Kakashi began to realize that the boy's main problem in the academy was twofold. First it was that his instructors had been improperly teaching him and second was that if he wasn't being taught improperly, he was being ignored and trying to obtain attention by being a class clown. Yet Naruto retained the information extremely well and learned very quickly. The concepts Kakashi was discussing with the boy weren't very advanced, but the amount of information Naruto was absorbing was immense and then being able to process it and respond with such understanding was shocking. He would make leaps in questions and concepts before Kakashi could get to them and would ask questions with accuracy and insight, which surprised the older shinobi of the child. Kakashi mentally sighed and shook his head. If anything, the kid might be a genius on the level with his father, and the academy instructors had nearly destroyed him. Kakashi and Guy were both well aware of the difference between being the Kyuubi no Yoko's container and being the Kyuubi himself. But for many in the village, that difference was lost on them. They merely combined the two and took out their anger on a small child. Kakashi had seen it more times than he cared to admit, the small blonde boy running from a crowd carrying torches, knives, kunai, and sometimes even swords. Often he would have rocks thrown at him while just trying to walk to class. Kakashi had intervened multiple times on the boy's behalf, and there were very few who wanted to fight the copy ninja, Sharingan Kakashi. But those times had been few and far between, as Kakashi was often away on missions as either a jonin or anbu captain. His sensei had always had a saying, there are no bad students, only bad teachers, and it was a belief that Kakashi had carried with him whenever he was asked to take command or become a jonin sensei. As Kakashi continued his lecture for Naruto and Guy worked with Kushina, a pair of figures walked up to the gate of Konoha as the early morning sun leapt over the trees' tops. One was a young woman in her late teens or with black hair and wearing a loose black kimono. The other was blonde woman with an extremely large chest who looked to be about 23 with a small diamond on her forehead. She wore green robes with a pale blue sleeveless shirt underneath. The guards noticed the pair immediately and, as they had been instructed to expect her, promptly sent a messenger to inform the Hokage of her arrival. They stood as she entered the building and bowed slightly. The slug princess of Konoha. A squad of Anbu appeared and the captain spoke to the duo. Good morning, Lady Tsunade, we have already sent a messenger ahead to inform the Hokage of your arrival. If you will please follow us, we will provide you and your companion an escort to the Hokage tower. Nodding to the captain, Tsunade began down the well-known path toward the tower, in which her mentor and sensei would be waiting for her. As the group walked, there was a small crowd already about on their daily business, even for this early in the morning, who cheered at the sight of one of their beloved Sannin and granddaughter of their Shodai Hokage. They smiled and waved, but Tsunade ignored it mostly. Tsunade's mind was busy with other matters. Kushina was alive, but if she was alive, then what about her son? Tsunade remembered that night vividly. It was just as the night she had lost Dan. Being back in Konoha brought those memories even further to the forefront of her mind. Flashback. The night had been lit by a beautiful full moon shining like a gemstone in the sky. The wind had torn the trees from the ground, and the ground had shaken the very roots of Konoha. The haunting aura surrounding the fox had been felt by every villager and shinobi alike. They had never seen anything like it before and it terrified them. The entire village had been emptied as every available shinobi had been called to hold back the great nine-tailed fox. The civilians had been sent to the shelters behind the Hokage mountain. The Kyuubi no Yoko had broken free of its restraints and was heading toward the village. Tsunade had returned to simply deliver the firstborn son of Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage and close friend of the blonde medic. The entire birth had been going well and was mostly over when Tsunade had been summoned away by an Anbu member, passing a request from the Hokage to aid in treating the injured. She hadn't wanted to leave Kushina, but with the boy born and everything looked to be well in hand, she had decided there was little danger. After all, who would attack the wife of Minato Namikaze? She was a hero of Konoha in her own right, the Crimson Death. And she knew that Anbu was protecting her, as ordered by Minato himself. Tsunade had decided that Kushina was safe and told her she was going to help the injured. Tsunade had looked at the exhausted woman and smiled gently to her as she held her young son in her arms. Sensei has asked I take command of the emergency medical staff near the front. Your son is strong and I know you'll be safe with the security that Minato has put in place. Just hold him and let him feed some, you both did very well. I understand, go to the front, Tsunade. That's where you're needed right now and thank you for coming back to help us. I don't know what we'd have done tonight if you had not have been here, Kushina responded with a slight bow of her head. Tsunade smiled at her and the small child in her arms, a smile that she hadn't known she still possessed since the death of her lover and brother. For the first time she felt like she had a family again and she felt so proud to be the small boy's godmother. Then flashback. Tsunade had learned just a few hours later that Kushina had vanished, supposedly dead. That Minato had sacrificed his life to defeat the nine-tailed fox and, although the details had been sketchy, and that Naruto, that small child, had not been found at the hospital, she had assumed he had died with his mother. The guilt that Tsunade had felt for not staying with Kushina that night had consumed her. It felt as if her entire soul had been torn from her body and that she had completely betrayed those who had trusted her. It was an irrational feeling, Tsunade knew that, but her heart and soul didn't care and she had spent many nights asking what if I had stayed. As she drowned her sorrow in a sake bottle. It had destroyed her, she had broken down and fled Konoha that very morning, with barely enough time to gather the simply bag she had brought with her. She had left without another word to her sensei or Jiraiya, and the only person who knew where she had gone was Shizune, her apprentice. She knew Shizune had told him where she was from time to time and let him know she was alright, but it mattered little to Tsunade. Now Tsunade stood before the Hokage tower and the only thing she wanted was answers. She was sober, clear-eyed, and on a mission. Tsunade marched into the tower, ignoring her escort and the Chunin who attempted to slow her. She slammed the doors to the Hokage office open and saw her old sensei seated behind the desk with his pipe in his mouth. "Alright sensei, I'm here, so where is Kushina and what the hell has been going on?" Chapter 5. Toads and Sanins. 2 days ago. It was very late, in fact it was so late that it really couldn't be called night anymore. It would be more accurate to say it was early morning. A white-haired older man dressed in a red coat and wooden sandals stumbled out of an establishment in one of the seedier districts of Tsunade. He held a sake bottle in his grasp and it was rather obvious from his eyes, demeanor and smell, he was well past being drunk and had worked hard to stay that way for several days. He knew he should have returned to Konoha immediately. In fact, he had remained in Suna longer than he had planned. But he simply couldn't face what going back to Konoha meant. Failure. Jiraiya of the Sannin may have been many things, pervert, super pervert, author, toad sage, spy master, but one thing he had never been was coward. But the day he left Naruto alone he knew he was running away and he had spent many nights ignoring his conscience that he should return to fulfill his duties as a godfather. He had convinced himself countless times Naruto was safe and sound, that he was better off in the village. Eventually though his conscience would catch up to him and he would end up the way he is now. He stumbled into an alleyway, the proud toad sage leaned against the wall of a building and fought the thoughts and self-accusations in his soul. "I kept him safe through my spy network, my work wouldn't allow me to take him with me, he was safer in Konoha than on the road, what kind of life would that be for a child anyway? I thought he'd be happier in Konoha, sensei said he would watch over him, more and more thoughts filled his mind, but even in his drunken stupor, his conscience would not be denied, he knew he was wrong and he knew he was going to get what was coming to him and soon. What was worse was he knew he deserved it. Memories came unbidden to him of the one time he had tried to fulfill his duties. He had finally garnered the will and galvanized his spirit to return to the child that was his grandson in everything but blood. The boy was 5 years old at the time. No one knew of course, but he had come back and seen the boy who looked almost like a replica of Minato and it had nearly sent him into shock. He had broken down on the spot as every memory of him and Minato rushed to the surface. His will had crumbled at the rush of emotions and he had run away without anyone ever knowing his dark secret. He knew after seeing how closely Minato's son resembled him, he could never fulfill his role as godfather. As Jiraiya slowly sank to the ground with his back against the wall, he began to feel a slight tingle run through his body. He knew instantly what it was, but the alcohol stopped him from reacting in time to stop the pulling sensation as he felt his body enter a dimensional void, leaving nothing more than a poof of smoke where the old sage had been. Jiraiya blinked and raised a hand as the sunlight of dawn flooded his eyes and caused him to wince. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the obvious chakra signatures around him. "It's a dream, it's a bad, very bad dream. I'm not on the mountain, I'm just unconscious in an alley in Suna." He muttered to himself even as he knew it wasn't true. Suddenly pain filled Jiraiya's senses as a loud whack sounded and a large lump formed immediately on the back of his skull. It was quickly joined by more as the sounds of whack, whack, whack echoed in the morning and lumps on his knees, ankles, and forehead appeared. "That dreamy enough for you Jiraiya boy. Now get yourself up, we've got words to be having with ya," a small frog with a grey goatee told him, and from the posture and tone of voice it was fairly obviously Fukasaku, one of the ancient toad sages, was not happy. Jiraiya tried to stand, but in his alcohol-induced state, he simply couldn't manage it. The old toad sage sighed and turned his head to regard his son and boss toad. "This is disgraceful, Bunta boy, mind sobering this old fool up for us?" Amabunta simply smiled viciously at the old man before him. "Be a pleasure pops." He grumbled. With a single movement and a subtle use of chakra, he brought his webbed foot down on the ground and sent Jiraiya up into the air, where he suddenly sent his tongue to catch the old pervert and with a slight flick, sent him head first into the ice-cold waters of the nearby lake. Jiraiya surfaced with a glare as the cold water shocked his system out of the alcoholic stupor he had previously been in. With a glare at the toads before him, he suddenly began to realize just how many toads were watching him quietly. There had to be hundreds of them looking on as Fukasaku, Shima, and Gamabunta waited for him at the shore of the lake. None of the toads looked happy. They all stood quietly watching, as if some sort of trial was being held, and he saw more than one look of quiet disdain for him. Shima stood holding a rather menacing rolling pin in her hands with a dark glare at the man before her. Fukasaku held his wooden rod quietly with a neutral expression, his eyes however, couldn't contain the obvious anger held behind them. Gamabunta seemed the least angry at his old friend, but even his rigid posture was vastly different from his normal relaxed demeanor, betraying his own emotions and the seriousness the situation demanded. Before Jiraiya could consider running for it, he felt Gamabunta's massive tongue encircle him and lift him from the water to be deposited on the land before the three toads. Hi guys, you look well," Jiraiya started before a loud whack silenced him as another bump added to the one he already had on the back of his head. Ouch. What was the silence? Gamabunta roared, "You were not brought here to speak, Jiraiya, you were brought here to listen, so shut up for once, you pervert, and listen." Fukasaku nodded to his son and fixed a glare on Jiraiya. "Jiraiya boy, we've recently received a very interesting message from the Monkey King Enma sent to us by the Hokage of Konoha," he began as his eyes narrowed at the man before him. "He asked us to help find you as a request by Kushina Uzumaki. Now, we don't want any of your excuses, so don't even try. We know Kushina was Minato boy's wife. The lad spent hours talking about her and how they were dating. Hell, he showed us the ring to get our opinion before he asked her. On top of that, when the message mentioned her son, Naruto, well, it left little in our mind who the boy's father could be or whose book he could be named after. First, we couldn't understand it. Minato boy's son, and you never mentioned him. Ma and I would have enjoyed spending time with the lad. We decided there must have been some reason the toads were never informed. Last we were told Minato boy and Kushina last both died the night of the Kyuubi attack. No mention was ever made of their child, and we assumed the boy lad had died with his parents. So we decided there must have been some kind of mistake, right? You'd never leave us in the dark about such an important matter after all, right?" Jiraiya's stomach clenched and his face paled as he realized where the old toad was going. The toads put a lot of emphasis on family and loyalty to family. It was no wonder there were so many toads watching the scene on the lakeshore. This was a trial. The toads considered family loyalty one of their highest priorities and would go to great lengths to protect each other. The idea that Jiraiya had shirked his duties, no matter the reason, a huge disgrace and insult to the toads. As the thoughts began to race through Jiraiya's mind, he realized what he had to lose here. If he didn't take the scene seriously, he could very well lose his contract with the toads. "So Ma and I went for a visit in Konoha to speak with Kushina Lass and the Hokage. They told us everything." Jiraiya Fukasaku's words made Jiraiya's heart stop as he went ever paler. "You were his godfather?" Shima roared at him, "After everything we taught you about loyalty to family, about putting others before you to protect them, you do what? You leave him. He was your responsibility, damn it all. We expected more out of your Jiraiya boy. So much more." Shima continued her rant for a moment before Fukasaku laid his webbed forehand on her shoulder to quiet her as he saw Jiraiya cowering before the three great toads. Fukasaku tapped his wooden rod on the ground before him to emphasize his points as he continued to the now silent and fully called Jiraiya. "Minato boy was precious to us as he was to you. He was special and a true genius. We loved him as we have you, a member of our own family. We mourn his loss as much as you did. But to know that Minato boy had a son you knew about and one, didn't tell us, and two, didn't take move to care of the boy is despicable. At the very least you should have informed the toads of Minato boy's son. We would have stepped up and offered our protection to the boy. You have crossed a terrible line here, Jiraiya." Jiraiya had sunken to his knees and hung his head, unable to come eye to eye with Fukasaku and Shima, while their son Gamabunta sat behind them. Gamabunta had a look of shame on his face as he looked at the white-haired Sannin. He had never imagined Jiraiya would ignore the son of the student he saw as family. For all that Gamabunta liked Jiraiya as his old friend and comrade, he simply couldn't mount any defense to overcome what had transpired, so he remained silent. The silence continued as the toad leaders glared at Jiraiya. Fukasaku nodded to his wife, who walked up to Jiraiya until she was right in front of him. "I know how hard you were hit by the loss of Minato boy. We all were. But that is no excuse to ignore Naruto. The least you could have done was inform the toads of his existence so we could watch over the boy. You messed up big this time, Jiraiya, real big. We can't let this just slide. Family is too important, whether it be by blood or bond. Under our contract we are ordering you to return to Konoha immediately to fulfill your role as godfather to the child and protect Kushina Uzumaki Namikaze and Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze. Further, we are restricting your rights of summoning under the contract. You may only summon the toads in the work to train and protect Minato boy's family, otherwise we will not answer your summons until we have deemed your debt to Minato boy and his family paid." "To understand," Jiraiya responded with little protest in his voice. He saw the toads begin to move away from him en masse from the scene at the beach. Jiraiya sighed to himself as he felt a familiar tingle run through his body, signifying he was being returned to his previous location within Tsunade. Rising from his knees, Jiraiya, the Toad Sannin and Spy Master, left the alley he had been returned to and began his journey back to Konoha. Present day. The third Hokage gave his student a slight smile before answering, "Hello to you too, Tsunade." He nodded toward the chair before him before speaking again, "Please hold all other appointments." My student and I will be talking for a while, he told his secretary as Tsunade took her seat, still fixing him with a glare. Once the doors were closed and he had activated several seals ensuring complete privacy. He then began to speak again in a smooth and conciliatory tone, "Thank you for coming, Tsunade, I know it's hard. Cut the crap, sensei, I don't care about the touchy-feely stuff, I want to know what the hell has been going on. I hate this village, the people in it, and the only reason I am here is because of this letter I got, which if it's a ruse I swear you will regret it." Tsunade told him, releasing a blast of direct killer intent toward her old sensei. The old man before her nodded to his former pupil as his face hardened at the implication he would lie to get her to return to the village. "First, you should know better than to expect me to lie to you to obtain your return to this village. Second, that letter was no ruse, Kushina has returned." With a skeptical look to her face, Tsunade nodded to her old sensei to continue. Hiruzen began to explain the events of the past week and a half. "Alright, 10 days ago Kushina Uzumaki came bursting through my doors. She was half crazed from malnutrition and had no clue where she was and barely remembered who she was. The only thing that made it through her head was that this office meant safety because it was where Minato was. In truth, I barely recognized her from her former self, and it was only her crying for Minato that made me take a closer look to realize who she was. She passed out and I had a medical team go over her and perform some muscle reconstruction and blood work here. I refused to allow it to leave this office." He opened a desk drawer and removed a manila folder from within, handing it to Tsunade before continuing. "They found trace elements of chemicals used to induce medical comas on patients in her bloodstream and extreme muscular atrophy. It took the medics nearly 20 hours straight to repair and rebuild her atrophied muscles enough so she could stand and walk on her own. It was a miracle for her to make it to the tower. The medic said she must have been running on pure adrenaline to manage it. When she awoke she told me the location of the door about her abduction. Apparently Danzo sent some of his pet root shinobi in the guise of Anbu and abducted Kushina shortly after Naruto was born. They then commenced with several tests before placing her in a medically induced coma. We believe her body built a resistance to the drug over time and she was able to fight her way to consciousness. Her ninja skills kicked in and forced her unconsciously to escape, where she made a blind dash to arrive here. She was barely conscious when she arrived and crying for Minato. She barely weighed 65 pounds and was skin and bones. It was a miracle and an act of pure will that allowed her to make it here." The Hokage remained silent for a moment, allowing Tsunade to process the information and go through the folder in her hands. She set the folder on the desk before her. The blonde woman remained quiet for a moment, her hands clenching the sides of the chair she was in. The wood was creaking under the stress of her grip. "You said these root were dressed as Anbu?" Tsunade asked as her old teacher nodded. She gripped the side. "When I left her at the hospital it was because Anbu said you requested my help in the field hospital." At the statement, Hiruzen's eyes widened slightly. "I never gave any such instruction, Tsunade. I know how hard the delivery had to be on you with the blood involved and wouldn't have asked more of you after that," he told her as another wave of guilt washed over her. A small part of her mind accused her, saying, "You should have stayed, it's your fault this happened." It had seemed so normal to have her go to the field hospital to help those injured. She hadn't even questioned the Anbu or gotten his code name. Tsunade's jaw clenched in anger and frustration at the now revealed betrayal and the realization of how deep Danzo had been in Konoha's system to pull off such a stunt under her nose. Nodding to the man, Tsunade took a deep breath to calm herself before speaking quietly, "There's more, isn't there?" Hiruzen nodded and took another deep breath. Once she was back she demanded to see Naruto. At the mention of the boy's name, Tsunade's shocked eyes shot open and locked onto her sensei's before silencing the older man with her own voice. "Wait, stop. Right. There. Naruto is alive. I thought he died the same night as Kushina and Minato. Why didn't you send word to me that he was alive, sensei? What the hell? He is my godson and my responsibility. How could you not tell me he survived?" Tsunade glared at the older man, releasing a significant amount of killer intent. Hiruzen coughed and looked uncomfortable at the question, failing to meet his student's furious gaze before finally taking a calming breath and meeting the blonde's eyes with his own to answer her. "The truth is, Tsunade, you ran away from the village before I had a chance to tell you, and when I finally got word you sounded completely broken. You were an emotional wreck who drowned her sorrow in sake and gambling. How could I ask you to take on the role of mother that knowing Naruto lived would demand of you? After the first few years I thought about trying to bring you back and even went so far as to leave a standing order with the Anbu that if you were seen to pass a request for you to return to the village. That's a load of bull, sensei, and you know it. If I had known Naruto was alive I would have returned to the village immediately. He was a connection to my past, the only one remaining with Minato and Kushina dead. How could you deny me that? It wasn't your choice to make, old man. Do you know many nights I poured sake down my throat trying to forget how I had failed that small baby and his parents? Do you? Tsunade yelled at the old Hokage before her as she stood up and slammed her fists into the wooden desk before her, leaving indentions into the polished wood. Tsunade noticed how her teacher seemed to grow older before her very eyes as he sighed. It wasn't until that moment that Tsunade realized how old Hiruzen Sarutobi was. His skin seemed to hold more wrinkles than she remembered, and his shoulders almost visibly sagged under the weight of the decisions he had made in his time as Hokage. His eyes were unfocused as he remembered the past decade and the decision he had made before refocusing on the present and his student. The old Hokage closed his eyes for a moment before speaking quietly to his old student, the truth of his words ringing in his tone. "The truth is, I made a mistake, and I am not so arrogant as to not admit it. I truly believed what I did was the right thing, but you are right, you deserve the chance to make the decision yourself. I should have called you back and told you. I'm sorry Tsunade, I know if you had known Naruto was alive, you would have come back. I failed Naruto in that regard, and by doing so Minato and Kushina as well." Sighing to herself, Tsunade simply couldn't remain angry at the old man. He had tried to do his best, but sometimes people simply made mistakes, and at least he had been willing to admit it. It was always a hard reminder that Hokages were people too, and not the all-knowing and all-powerful beings people believed. Tsunade returned to her seat, and the two were quiet for a moment before she finally spoke again. "Okay sensei, we'll discuss it more later, and I am still angry with you about this, but please continue," she told him. Nodding to her, Hiruzen resumed his story. "Once she was awake, the first thing she wanted was to see Naruto. After getting her to eat and shower, we left for the academy, and she nearly fainted on the spot at seeing him. It was rather an adorable moment for the two of them. I had my crystal ball take pictures, I'll show you some time." After several discussions, Kushina demanded Minato's effects and will and moved into the Namikaze district with Naruto and dragged Kakashi along with her for protection. She wanted to announce their new status as Minato's family immediately, but I managed to convince her to wait until you and Jiraiya returned for extra protection against any enemies both inside and outside of the village. Currently Guy and Kakashi have been overseeing Kushina's rehabilitation and Naruto's remedial training. "I see, and why exactly does Naruto need remedial training?" The blonde before him asked as her eyes narrowed, her mind already reaching conclusions about the reasons motivating such a move. According to Kakashi, Kushina and Guy, Naruto has been instructed incorrectly by the academy professors for several years before Iruka took an interest in the boy. I was going to take care of the situation, but Kushina requested I wait until she was well enough to handle the situation personally, the old Hokage told her as he grimaced at the idea of what Kushina might be thinking. "Well, I will say you made one hell of a gigantic mess here. What about Danzo and his route? I am assuming you haven't just let him get away with kidnapping Minato's wife. And if he's still alive, I want a piece of that ugly old bastard." Tsunade told him with a murderous glint in her eye that promised a long time of torture. "Here's inside again, Danzo's route have been dealt with, but Danzo himself has escaped. We did manage to rescue all of the children he was training and all of the information on his experiments and plans. We are still going through it all, but it looks like he was scalping the orphanages for the best candidates for potential shinobi. We managed to rescue over 200 children from ages 2 to 12. It is disturbing to think that in a few more years he would have likely doubled the size of his root forces. I'd like you to look over some of them that have more severe training injuries if you don't mind. We'll see. I am not here to help you or the village sensei. I am here because Kushina and Naruto need me, and I have a responsibility to Naruto as his godmother. Now, before we take a little trip to visit the Namikaze district, tell me something. Where was Jiraiya in all of this?" She asked him with an evil gleam shone from the eyes of the blonde woman as she said the name of her former teammate. "Jiraiya, well, from what I have heard, should be on his way back. I know the message I sent him got through," he told her carefully. Tsunade raised an eyebrow at that. "You know that's now what I mean sensei. Where has Jiraiya been for the past 10 years? He is Naruto's godfather after all, and I know he didn't run off like I did. So where is the old pervert and, judging by your reaction, why has he not been here? I think it would be best to ask Jiraiya that himself when he arrives, don't you think?" Hiruzen told her as he skirted the subject carefully to avoid angering the blonde Sannin before him. As she narrowed her eyes, Tsunade nodded. "I suppose you're right sensei, it would be easier to ask him in person, and there would be less chance of him escaping if he doesn't have a damn good reason for not being here. Now, I think we were about to make a short trip to the Namikaze district, weren't we?" "Yes, but before we go there is something we need to discuss," the Hokage told her with a seriousness he hadn't held before. With a nod from his student he continued. "I'm concerned with Kushina's mental stability. I've been receiving reports from Kakashi daily, and while her physical health has continued to improve thanks to Guy's rehabilitation training, it is obvious that her mental health isn't keeping up. It is to be expected in some part since she woke to a loss of 10 years of her life, but he says he has noticed her spacing out randomly. Or she will stare at places around the district or the house or gardens, as if expecting someone to come around the corner. From what Kakashi tells me, she seems to lose herself in memories rather than staying in the present. About the only thing that seems to keep her in the here and now is Naruto. I'm worried the stress of losing so much at once may be too much for her mind to handle. I want you to watch her, and if you think it's necessary to arrange for a psychological evaluation immediately with Inoichi. Tsunade remained quiet for a moment as her mind processed the information before speaking. Her voice was barely above a whisper. To wake up to find your husband dead, 10 years have passed by with you asleep, and your son a stranger to you and his own family would be jarring for anyone. The fact that she is as functioning as well as you say is a miracle within itself. I'll keep an eye on her, and if I see anything I think is out of place, I'll order an examination. But the Node Hiruzen took his hat from the stand beside his desk and rose to make his way out of the officer with Tsunade not far behind him. They were silent now, both digesting the information they had been given. As Tsunade made her way toward the Namikaze district with the old Hokage in tow, Kushina Uzumaki was currently lost in the memories of 10 years prior. She was sitting in the old rose garden of the Namikaze manor. It was a beautiful place, and she had slowly and painstakingly been tending it in an effort to restore its former beauty. The garden was a large section in the middle of the house itself. The house surrounded the garden in walls of stone and polished wood, but you would never notice if you sat within it. The trees, bushes, and flowers within had become overgrown with time since she had last been here, but the smell of the roses still filled the air. The gurgle of the small stream with its many miniature waterfalls played a melody in the air with a natural and alluring harmony, making it hard to walk away. The smell of the roses on the air was intoxicating but not too sweet. The entire setting was one of simple beauty and grace. Kushina had often thought of Minato and the Namikaze clan he described as similar to the garden they had built. They had been simple people who enjoyed life but were hardened warriors when needed. They enjoyed the simple things such as family and peace and quiet, but held some of the most brilliant minds on sealing and complex jutsu in the world. Minato had been just like them. He had wiped out half of the Iwa army during the war, and yet he was the kindest and gentlest man in the world. He was considered the most powerful shinobi of his generation, but acted as if it didn't matter. He was approachable, loving, kind, strong. Kushina shook her head to clear her thoughts. She often found herself thinking of Minato these days, and it always led to tears she did her best to hold back. Kushina was here this morning after her initial training with Guy. She sat, lost in her memories of Minato when they had first come here. It had been a cool evening, and he had told her he wanted to share something with her. This garden was a special place to Kushina, and it brought her comfort, as if the world hadn't changed around her while she slept. If she closed her eyes she could still see Minato from that night. Minato had worn a dark blue button-up shirt which contrasted his bright blonde hair and made his blue eyes shine. He had on black pants, and his smile seemed to brighten her entire world. They had secretly been dating for nearly 4 months, and it was like a part of her life had finally become complete. They had known each other for years and been friends since they had graduated from the academy, but it wasn't until the shinobi from Kumo had attempted to kidnap her that she had realized how much he cared for her. He had brought her here, into his family's ancestral home. The streets were dark and quiet as he explained to her the sad story of his family. He told her of his dream of restoring the district and having a family, and to restore his clan and bring down the dimensional walls that surrounded his family's district. Then he had brought her here, to the rose garden in his home. They had sat on the very bench which Kushina now occupied alone. A tear passed down her cheek as the thought of Minato passed through her mind. Her eyes were closed and her mind so busy with her memories that she didn't notice the small presence that came to her side. Mommy," Naruto said as he watched a first tear followed by another. Kushina opened her eyes and wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand and smiled at her son. He was her world now, the only thing which kept her sane in the mass of emotions and memories which rose, often, unbidden. "Mommy, why are you crying?" her son asked her. "I was just remembering Naru, this is where your father brought me the first time he brought me into the Namikaze district," she told him with a small sad smile. Naruto had been avoiding asking his mother much about his father. He saw how she cried when she saw certain things in the house, such as clothing or pictures. He wanted to see his mother smile, but he didn't know how, and when he had asked Kakashi what to do, the older man had advised Naruto to simply try and be there for her and to listen. Mom, could we talk about Dad?" Naruto asked hesitantly, hoping his mother wouldn't cry or get upset. It had been so hard these past few days, his mother always so distant and lost in her memories. Kushina was shocked for a moment. Aside from their initial conversations, she realized she hadn't told Naruto very much about Minato and felt ashamed she had allowed her own private grief to deny her son something so important. She smiled gently down at her son. "Of course Naru, I'd like that, why don't you climb up into my lap and I'll start with this garden." With a happy smile and a nod, the 10-year-old promptly jumped into the seat beside his mother, only to have her pull him onto her lap and wrap her arms around him. She smiled at him. He looked so much like Minato it was scary at times, but where Minato was quiet and reserved, Naruto had her brash and energy-filled personality. "Oh Minato, I know you'd have loved him dearly," she thought to herself. "Well, you see Naru, your dad and I met at the Ninja Academy. I was a refuge from the former Whirlpool country. My homeland and clan was destroyed during the Third Great Shinobi War. To my knowledge all of my family was wiped out that day. It was only fate that allowed me to survive. I wasn't there at the time of the attack. You see I was brought here before that to aid the Senju clan. You see Naru, our family are cousins of the Senju, in fact the first Hokage was married to an Uzumaki," she told as he gasped at the thought of his family being related to the founding Hokage of Konoha. Smiling, Kushina continued, "At first I thought your father was a big wimp. When they asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up he told us he wanted to be the most beloved Hokage ever to live." Kushina blushed slightly. "I actually laughed at him for that. It wasn't until after the academy that we started to get to know each other. We were both assigned to different sensei, but often found our teams working together on missions. I didn't even know he liked me until an incident with some Kumo shinobi happened. You see, our blood has some rather special abilities in it. We have the ability to suppress Biju, much like the Senju," she told with a proud smile. Mom, what's a Biju?" Naruto asked hesitantly. Kushina ruthlessly suppressed the sense of righteous anger that spiked within her soul at the simple question by her son, "Those ungrateful bastards at the academy. As soon as those two Sannin are back I'm going to level that place with those bastard instructors inside it." It took her a moment to pull her mind away from the thoughts of castrating and burning academy instructors alive to answer Naruto's question. "A Biju is a chakra monster. It's where chakra which resides naturally in the world have coalesced and condensed into a sentient thinking creature most people call demons. Our family and the Senju clan were gifted with the ability to suppress these demons' chakra, similar to a bloodline trait within our clan." "Did Dad's family have a bloodline as well?" Naruto asked her. "If he did your father never mentioned it to me so I don't think so. He said that there was some speculation about one before he was born because some of his clansmen found themselves able to heal and recover quicker than most, but it never seemed to settle into the entire clan. Probably because they were almost wiped out from the subsequent ninja wars. Your father's family was more known for their family jutsus. They were one of the only clan capable of using space-time jutsus with precision and regularity and were known as some of the greatest seal masters in the world," she said as she giggled remembering the blonde-haired teen who had asked for her help with seals. "Actually it was one of the things which brought your father and I together," she told Naruto. "The Uzumaki family has deep traditions in sealing, and we held some of the most powerful seals in the world in our family library. Sealing was considered a family specialty, so we were taught them at an early age, so I was fairly adept even before coming to Konoha, and I continued to train myself on my own. Minato asked me to give him some pointers with more advanced seals when he a bit older. I never knew he was creating a new jutsu at the time though." Kushina smiled as she remembered the day when she was 14 and Minato had asked her to lunch to talk about some advanced seals she had brought with her to study from her homeland. She hadn't known then about his work on the Hirishin jutsu. Although it was just an idea in the back of his mind at the time and he wouldn't have the ability to even begin considering work on it until several years later. During the silence Naruto looked up at his mother and smiled brightly at her, his eyes seemed to radiate the intense emotions inside him. "Mom, thank you for coming back." "Oh my little Naru," she said. She leaned over and kissed his hair. "I just wish you hadn't had to be alone for so long. I wish I had been there to watch over you, but I am now and I promise you won't ever be alone again. I'll be there when you go on your first date, when you graduate, when you get fight in the Chunin exam, when you become Hokage, and when you get married and have children. I promise my little Naru, I won't let you be alone ever again," she told him with conviction, making the promise to both him and herself never to allow her son to live without his family again. "Now, how about I tell you about the Uzumaki clan huh?" she asked with a slight smile as he nodded to her. Naruto listened on as his mother spoke, drinking in every word she said as he wrapped his arms around her waist, slowly tightening his grip and nuzzled into her body. For the first time in his life he had a family. In his head he knew that from the first day his mother had come back into his life. Yet the shock of that feeling finally had begun to settle into the little boy's life as the changes which had taken place finally began to settle down. Kushina could feel warm tears beginning to burst forth from the dam of emotion that Naruto had been holding back for so long. Everything lately had been like a dream. He had a family, a history, not just one but two clans he came from. The shock of everything was finally beginning to wear off and Naruto just couldn't hold it inside anymore. As he held his mother, he let the emotions he had bottled up for years, the fear of being unloved, the feeling of being alone and hated and finding himself in a home where he was wanted and the relief his fears were unfounded come forth. Kushina placed her arms around his son and felt her own tears beginning to flow freely as the mother and son comforted each other. For the first time since awakening, Kushina allowed someone else to see her cry for her loss of the man who had brought such joy to her life. And in the peace of the garden within the Namikaze manor, the last of the Namikaze held each other, allowing emotional walls they had put up to be slightly pulled away and bringing them closer. What if Naruto denies the civilian council? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.